Welcome to the Cursed Hour, where every whisper in the dark, every creak in the floor, might be something watching threes. If you found this channel, you're already part of the curse. Whispers of the old school. I thought I'd found the perfect home. A charming loft in an old building with a history that whispered through its walls. A former Catholic school turned into apartments. But within weeks, the warmth I'd felt turned to dread, as if the very air was watching me, waiting for me to notice the darkness lurking within. I began to feel that I was never alone in the apartment, and soon, the shadows started to take shape, revealing a presence I couldn't ignore. The building stood like a relic of another era. Its stone facade weathered but imposing, with faded carvings above the entryways that read Boys and Girls Threes. It had formerly been a Catholic school, a place where generations of children had once studied their laughter, long since silenced threes. When I moved in, the apartment felt like a sanctuary, its high ceilings and large windows letting in streams of sunlight that danced across the hardwood floors. I could almost picture the classroom it had once been, filled with desks and chalkboards, now replaced by my eclectic furniture and a few potted plants. The space felt cozy, welcoming, as if it had been waiting for someone to breathe life into it again. My cat Luna seemed to love it too, curling up in the sunspots near the windows, her purring a soft soundtrack to my days. But as the weeks passed, a subtle shift began to creep in, like a shadow stretching across a sunny afternoon. The tone of it just seemed to change all of a sudden, the warmth giving way to a heaviness I couldn't quite name. It wasn't fear, not at first, just a nagging sense of unease, as if someone was always standing just out of sight. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone, but there was never anyone there. The feeling grew stronger near the bathroom, a small space with faded tiles and a chipped sink that seemed to hold a sorrow I couldn't explain. The bathroom felt strange, sad, like deep regrets, and I found myself avoiding it, rushing through my routines to escape the oppressive weight that settled over me whenever I stepped inside. Luna sensed it too, her behavior shifting in ways that made my skin prickle. She would often go towards the kitchen and sit there, staring at empty corners with an intensity that unnerved me, her ears twitching as if she heard something I couldn't. At night, the apartment seemed to come alive with whispers I couldn't place. I'd lie in bed, the loft's raised platform giving me a clear view of the bathroom and the staircase leading to the kitchen below. Often when I was in my bed, I would sense something moved from the bathroom down the stairs and into the kitchen. A flicker of movement in the corner of my eye that vanished when I turned to look. Sometimes it was just a feeling, a chill, that made me pull the blankets tighter. But other times, I swore I saw a shadow, tall, formless, gliding silently through the darkness. The unease in the apartment became a constant companion, a weight that pressed down on me even when I left the buildings. I confided in my father, who had always been fascinated by the mystical threes. My dad. He lived nearby, and I visited him at least once a week, often. Finding comfort in his cluttered study, filled with books on metaphysics and the occult threes, I expected him to dismiss my fears with a laugh. But instead, he listened intently, his expression so serious. He shared a story from his own past, about a time when his step-nephews had seen a shadowy mass in his kitchen, a presence that vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. He believed it had moved on after I left his house, but now it seemed it had followed me. Things took a darker turn when my boyfriend Ethan came to stay. I'd warned him about the strange feelings I'd been having, but I hadn't shared the full extent of my fears. The first night that he was there, he woke me up to say that my cat was going crazy. Her sudden leap onto the high ledge above our bed, startling him awake. Threes. He couldn't understand how she'd gotten up there without him noticing the ledge too high for her to jump from the floor. I brushed it off, blaming it on her quirky behavior. But the next day, Ethan's demeanor changed entirely. He was pale when I returned from work, his voice shaky as he recounted what he'd seen. He said that he'd been on his laptop on the couch and started to feel watched, an unshakable sensation that made his skin crawl. When he looked up, he saw a figure, a tall, shadowy man, standing in the kitchen, staring at him with an intensity that froze him in place. Thinking it was an intruder, he lunged toward it, but the figure vanished before he could reach it, leaving only a cold emptiness in its wake. Ethan's experience forced me to confront the truth I'd been avoiding. Whatever was in the apartment wasn't just a figment of my imagination. I then came clean about everything that I'd experienced, and he was furious that I hadn't told him sooner. He refused to stay alone in the apartment after that, spending his days at the library while I was at work. Too afraid to face the unseen presence again, the tension between us grew, the apartment's oppressive atmosphere driving a wedge into our relationship. We decided to move out sooner than planned, packing our belongings in a frantic rush as the air around us seemed to pulse with anger. The apartment still felt charged and very unwelcoming, as if it resented our decision to leave. 3s. On our last day, as we carried the final boxes down the stairs, I felt a cold breeze brush past me, a fleeting touch that made me shivers. But once we left, the heaviness lifted, and I've never felt that presence again. I still have no idea what it was or why it latched onto me, but I'm grateful to have escaped its grasp. The unseen threat at midnight. In the dead of night, alone in my apartment with only my cats for company, I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice. A ragged, heavy breathing just outside my door, as if something sinister was waiting to strike. I thought the locked metal door would keep me safe, a barrier between me and the dangers of the world. But when I peered through the peephole, a single bloodshot eye stared back, unblinking, filled with a malice that made my heart stop. But I live in an apartment building that has 4 apartments on each floor. And that night, I learned that even the strongest locks couldn't protect me from the terror that lurked just beyond. The building I called home was old, its walls steeped in the quiet hum of decades past. A place where neighbors kept to themselves, and the hallways echoed with a stillness that often felt comforting. The apartments are split into 2 groups by something we call a bubble, a shared space sealed off by a heavy metal door meant to keep intruders at bay. My husband, a doctor, was often away on night shifts, leaving me to tend to our home while he saved lives. I'd grown used to the routine, tidying up, doing laundry, and keeping myself entertained with podcasts as the city outside settled into a restless slumber. My 2 cats, Luna and Milo, were my constant companions, their playful antics a source of joy in the quiet evenings. I have 2 cats, Xena, who is 5 years old, and Marcello is 3 months old. Their names in the original story replaced to avoid repetition, but their presence just as vital to mine. That night, I was in the middle of a particularly chilling podcast episode, one about home invasions that sent a shiver down my spine with every word. I tried to focus on folding laundry, the rhythmic task, a distraction from the eerie tales, but a sudden change in the cat's behavior snapped me out of my thoughts. Luna, usually the most relaxed of the pair, froze mid-step, her eyes locked on the door, her body tense as if she sensed something I couldn't. Milo mirrored her, his tiny frame rigid, his gaze unblinking. A low guttural sound escaped Luna's throat, a warning that made my skin prickle. Puss. I turned down the volume on the podcast, my ears straining for any sound beyond the door, my pulse quickening with every passing second. The silence was shattered by a noise that made my breath catch, a heavy, labored breathing, like someone struggling for air just on the other side of the doors. I couldn't hear much except a distinguished sound, of a very heavy breathing. The kind that sounded wrong, unnatural, as if it belonged to someone or something on the edge of collapse. I crept closer, my heart pounding in my chest, and pressed my ear against the cold wood, hoping I'd imagined it. But the sound grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by a faint scratching that sent a wave of dread through me. I pulled back from the door, my hands trembling as I reached for something, anything, to defend myself. My mind raced with the stories I'd just heard on the podcast. Tales of intruders who stalked their victims, waiting for the perfect moment to strike us. I immediately started looking around the house for something to defend myself, with my eyes landing on my husband's baseball bat, propped against the wall in the corner of the living room. I grabbed it, the weight of it in my hands, a small comfort against the rising panic, and turned back to the door, steeling myself for what might come next. I needed to protect Luna and Milo, my instincts kicking into overdrive as I scooped them up and hurried to the kitchen. I took my cats and hid them in the cupboard under the sink, their soft fur brushing against my arms as I whispered reassurances I didn't quite believe. With the cats safe, I returned to the door, the bat gripped tightly in my hands, and cautiously approached the peephole. My breath hitched as I looked through it, and what I saw made my stomach drop. A single, veiny red eye, bulging and unblinking, staring directly at me as if it knew I was watching. The breathing intensified faster now, a frantic rhythm that mirrored my own racing heartbeat. I froze, my body locked in place by fear, hoping that if I stayed still, whoever, or whatever, was out there would leave. But the doorknob began to rattle, a violent, desperate shaking that echoed through the apartment, the sound of metal scraping against metal, sending chills down my spine. I could feel the malice behind that door, a dark intent that made my knees weak. I stepped back, clutching the bat, my mind screaming at me to do something, anything, to stop this nightmare from unfolding. Then an idea struck me, a desperate last-ditch effort to scare off the intruders. I rushed to the living room, which is very close to the entrance door, and blast out Scary Story podcast, sounds turning the volume as high as it would go. The narrator's deep, commanding voice filled the apartment, a booming presence that sounded like a man was right there with me, speaking with authority. I prayed it would be enough to make the intruder think I wasn't alone, that someone stronger, someone dangerous was inside, ready to confront them. To my relief, it worked. As the rattling stopped, the breathing faded, and when I dared to look through the peephole again, the hallway was empty. As I went back to the door and checked the peephole for that creepy guy, he was no longer there, but my relief turned to dread when I noticed the metal door leading to the bubble was wide open, swinging gently on its hinges. My neighbor, an elderly woman who managed the building, appeared at her door, her face a mix of confusion and annoyance at the noise. We spoke briefly, piecing together what had happened, but the mystery of how that door had been opened, when my husband had locked it before leaving, remained unsolved. I'm thankful that that guy didn't get in, but the memory of that night still lingers, a reminder of how close I came to something truly terrifying. Shadows on the sandy shore. Camping on a secluded beach with my boyfriend was supposed to be a dream come true. A week of starlit nights and the soothing crash of waves. But it turned into a nightmare when a stranger's voice whispered through our tent, chilling me to the bones. We thought we could escape the chaos of the nearby partygoers, but the woman I'd seen dancing in the streets, wild and unhinged, had followed us back. Her presence, a dark omen in the night. I always felt as if I was being watched, and on that moonlit shore, I realized we weren't as alone as we thought. The idea of camping on the beach had always been a fantasy of mine. A chance to fall asleep to the rhythm of the ocean, to wake up with the sun painting the horizon in shades of gold. We had the nice idea of camping in the beach instead of going to a hotel, setting up our little sanctuary on a stretch of sand, dotted with other tents, a mix of couples, families, and lone travelers seeking the same escape. Our spot was perfect. A cozy nook near the dunes, with access to public facilities nearby, ensuring we had everything we needed for a comfortable stay. The area had public restrooms with showers and restaurants, so the matter of hygiene and hunger wasn't an issue, allowing us to focus on the beauty of the experience. We'd packed carefully, bringing a tent designed to block out the sun, a soft inflatable mattress, and a small lantern that cast a warm glow inside our temporary home, Threes. The first few days were idyllic. We swam in the ocean, collected shells along the shore, and watched the stars blanket the sky each night, Threes. But the beach wasn't as serene as it seemed. There were plenty of people that would camp there, and while most were friendly, others brought a different energy. Late-night parties filled with music smoke and the sharp tang of alcohol wafting through the airs. We kept our distance, content to enjoy our own quiet moments, sipping drinks by the water as the firelight from neighboring camps flickered in the distance. One evening, we ventured into the nearby town, drawn by the lively streets filled with street performers and food stalls. The atmosphere was electric. A crowd gathered around a guitarist, strumming a soulful melody. But the music wasn't what held their attention. It was a woman staggering through the street, her movements erratic as she danced without a care, her body bare except for the moonlight clinging to her skin. In the middle of the crowded street, where vendors called out to passers-by, she twirled, her laughter sharp and disjointed, her eyes glazed with the haze of intoxication. My boyfriend, Mark, and I exchanged a glance, both unsettled by the scene, and we quickly left the image of her wild abandon etched into my mind. Back at our tent, we tried to shake off the unease, pouring ourselves a drink and settling on the sand to watch the stars. The ocean's gentle rhythm should have been soothing, but the distant sounds of the woman and her friends who had set up camp not far from ours kept me on edge. They had a camp set on the same beach with us, a few tents further from us, their fire casting flickering shadows that danced across the dunes, their voices carrying over the waves as they continued their revelry. She was still there, her silhouette unmistakable, even in the darkness, now draped in a sheer skirt that did little to cover her wading into the icy water with a recklessness that made me shiver. Mark noticed my tension and squeezed my hand, his voice calm but firm. He just shrugged and told me not to be bothered, suggesting we ignore them and focus on ourselves. I nodded, trying to push the feeling aside, and we crawled into our tent, leaving the flap partially open to let the warm night air flow through. The sound of the waves lulled me into a restless sleep, but it wasn't long before I was jolted awake by a sound that sent a chill through me. Soft, deliberate footsteps circling our tent. The crunch of sand underfoot, too close for comfort. A voice followed, feminine and haunting, singing a melody that felt more like a threat than a lullaby. My heart raced as I lay still, too terrified to move the thin fabric of the tent, doing nothing to shield me from the presence outside. 3 threes. I was too afraid to even change my position, as to not indicate to the outsider that I noticed their presence. My breath shallow as I peered through the mosquito netting. The footsteps paused near my head, and then I saw her. A pair of bare feet, a familiar sheer skirt, trailing behind, swaying in the breeze. It was the woman from the street, her shadow looming over us, something glinting in her hand as she stood just outside. I stayed frozen, my mind racing with fear, unable to sleep, as the woman lingered, her eerie song echoing in the night. The next morning, we packed our tent and we moved to a different area of the beach further away, desperate to escape her unsettling presence. Threes. we found a new spot, far from the partygoers. The solitude a welcome relief, but the memory of that night stayed with me. A reminder that even the most beautiful places can hide dangers in the shadows. The orb of the night woods. On a crisp, clear night in New Jersey, my friend and I lay on my roof wrapped in blankets, our eyes fixed on the sky in search of shooting stars, until a strange light turned our wonder into what started as a faint glow in the distance became a glowing orb, moving with eerie precision through the treetops. Its silent approach filled with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. It was a perfectly defined, glowing sphere of light the size of a basketball. And as it drifted closer, I realized we were no longer just stargazing. We were being hunted. The night was perfect for stargazing, the kind where the air is sharp and the stars seem close enough to touch. A friend and I were stargazing on my roof in a dry, clear night in New Jersey, our breaths visible in the chilly air as we scanned the heavens for the faint streaks of a meteor showers. Duos. We'd brought snacks and a thermos of hot cocoa, the warmth a comfort, as we waited for the sky to put on its show. But the meteors were sparse, leaving us to chat about school and dreams, our laughter echoing softly in the quiet neighborhood. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A flicker of light, not in the sky, but in the forest that bordered my backyard. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection from a distant street lamp. But it moved, darting through the trees with a speed that made my heart skip a beat. We turned around and we see what looks like a bright blue-white LED flashlight traveling into the forest behind the house. Its glow unnatural against the dark canopy. "Is that the police?" my friend Jake whispered, his voice tinged with confusion. We both sat up, straining to make sense of it. But the light wasn't on the ground. It was weaving through the treetops. Its path too fluid, too deliberate to be human. The light grew brighter as it approached, its movement slowing as if it sensed our presence. It was traveling along the direction of the river behind our house, a narrow stream that cut through the woods, its waters hidden by the dense foliage. The orb stopped at the edge of our property, hovering in a clearing just a short distance away, and then turned sharply, gliding toward us with a purpose that sent a shiver down my spine. I could feel its gaze, an unseen force that seemed to weigh on my chest, as if it knew we were watching, coming straight toward us, as if it had noticed us and wanted to check us out. The sphere pulsed with a strange energy, its surface swirling with what looked like liquid light. We didn't wait to see what it wanted. The moment the orb began its slow, deliberate approach, a primal fear took over, and we bolted, scrambling down the ladder from the roof in a frantic rush. We scrambled off the roof and ran inside, our footsteps echoing on the wooden floor as we dove into the living room, grabbing a blanket to shield ourselves, as if it could protect us from whatever that thing was. We were teenagers, too old to hide like children. But the terror was real, stripping away any pretense of bravery. Crouched under the blanket, we whispered to each other, our voices trembling as we tried to make sense of what we'd seen. Emitting absolutely no sound at all, the orb had moved with an eerie silence, its presence more unsettling because of the absence of noise. No hum, no buzz, just a void where sound should have been. I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been aware of us, its movements too calculated, too intentional to be random. We stayed hidden for what felt like hours, too afraid to look out the window, too afraid to move, until the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, bringing with it a fragile sense of safety. The next day, we ventured into the woods hoping to find some explanation. A prankster with a drone, a lost hiker with a lantern. But there was nothing. The clearing where the orb had hovered was untouched. No footprints, no broken branches, just the quiet murmur of the river nearby. Down by the river in the same patch of woods, the air felt different, heavier, as if the forest itself remembered what had happened. We didn't talk about it much after that, the experience. Too strange, too unexplainable to put into words. But it lingered in the back of my mind, a puzzle I couldn't solve. Years later, the memory resurfaced when a neighbor came to my door, his face pale and his eyes wide with fear. He told me he'd been walking near the river with a friend when they were chased by a glowing ball of light, silent and relentless, its glow casting long shadows through the trees. I assumed that he was telling the truth because I had never told him the story of my encounter, and the similarity sent a chill through me. Whatever that orb was, it wasn't a one-time visitor. It was still out there, haunting the woods, waiting for its next encounter. The shadow in our room. In a house steeped in sorrow, where every creak of the floorboards echoed with the pain of my childhood, I thought I'd faced the worst, until an unseen darkness invaded the room I shared with my sister, bringing with it a stench of decay and a terror I couldn't escape. My sister's once vibrant spirit faded, replaced by hollow eyes and whispered secrets from a presence that seemed to know our every move, its influence seeping into our lives like a poison. The whole room starts smelling like rotten flesh, and as the nights grew colder, I realized we were no longer alone in that cursed space, our sanctuary. Now a battleground for something far more sinister than our past. Our home was a prison of misery, a place where love was a distant memory overshadowed by the cruelty of our parents. I grew up with toxic parents, their anger a constant storm that left me scarred. My days spent battling a depression that clung to me like a shadows. I'd retreat to the corner of my room, the only space I could call my own, where I'd cry until my throat was raw, the walls absorbing my pain like a sponge. I shared my room with my younger sister who was badly abused by my mother, her suffering a mirror to mine, her cries echoing through the night as our mother's rage turned on her. The room became a vessel for our grief, its air thick with the weight of our shared trauma, the peeling wallpaper and faded carpet, a testament to the years of neglect. I'd often wake in the night, my body frozen, unable to move, as if an invisible force pinned me to the beds. I thought it was just sleep paralysis, a cruel trick of my mind, but the sensation of being watched, of something tugging at my soul, never left me. Then Emily, my younger sister, returned from a visit to our cousin, her face pale, her hands trembling as she spoke of a ritual she'd witnessed. My younger sister went to visit my cousin, and my cousin told her that she was possessed by a demon, describing a dark ceremony involving mirrors and smoke meant to sow discord in the neighborhoods. Emily's voice shook as she recounted the experience, her eyes wide with a fear I'd never seen before. I tried to comfort her, dismissing her story as the delusions of our troubled cousin, who had been diagnosed with schizophrenia after claiming to speak to unseen beings. She swears that she felt a spirit during the rituals, her words haunting me despite my skepticism. But Emily's behavior began to change in ways I couldn't ignore. She stopped eating, refused to bathe her body, marked by bruises that appeared overnight, as if something were draining her from the inside. She spoke of a spirit guiding her, telling her things. No one could know her voice, hollow, her eyes shadowed. She would know where someone was going, and why, predicting movements with an eerie accuracy that sent chills down my spine. Her presence in the room growing more unsettling with each passing day. The room we shared became a place of dread, its once familiar corners now cloaked in an oppressive darkness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The smell was only getting worse, and it was mostly coming from her side of the room, a foul odor that reeked of decay, as if something dead were trapped within the walls. I scrubbed the floors, moved the furniture, and aired out the space, but the stench only grew stronger, clinging to everything like a curse. I forced Emily into the bathroom. her protests weak as I stood guard, ensuring she bathed, hoping the ritual of cleanliness would banish the darkness. Threes, but the smell persisted, and Emily's condition worsened her body, a canvas of bruises and exhaustion. Threes, she would always wake up tired, having the deepest black eyes, and a lot of bruises as well. Her once bright gaze now hollow, her movements sluggish, as if something were siphoning her vitality. Emily's behavior grew stranger, her words tinged with an unnatural certainty. She'd predict our father's arrival down to the second, her voice flat as she announced his return before we even heard the car in the driveway. She seemed to know things she shouldn't, where our neighbors were headed, what they were planning. Her influence over others, growing her whispers, bending them to her will. She'd find dead rats in her purse, their tiny bodies cold and stiff, as if placed there by an unseen hand. Her explanations vague and unsettling. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was using her, speaking through her. Its presence, a shadow that loomed over us both. One night, our youngest sister Lily joined us in the room, seeking comfort in our shared space. I was in the living room, my books spread out before me, the dim light of a lamp casting long shadows on the walls. When I finally entered the bedroom, a wave of dread washed over me. The air was thick, unbreathable, the stench so overpowering it made my stomach churn. When I opened the door, it smelled horrible, like something had died in there, the odor so intense I could taste it, a rancid tang that clung to the back of my throat. I opened the window, desperate for fresh air, but the room remained suffocating, the darkness pressing in like a living thing. My instinct screamed at me to flee, to take Lily and run, but I pushed the thought aside, convincing myself it was just my imagination, that the smell was from damp furniture or some mundane cause. I lay down, the air growing heavier with each passing moment, a weight that seemed to crush my chest. Then I felt it, a sensation so alien, so wrong, that my heart stopped. I felt like my hands were not mine, as if they belonged to someone else, moving against my will to touch my body. The sensation, cold and invasive, like icy fingers trailing across my skin. I opened my eyes, and there it was, a towering black figure at the foot of my bed, its form so dark it seemed to absorb the light around it, its presence radiating a malice that made my blood run cold. The figure loomed over me, its edges shifting like smoke, its form both solid and ethereal, as if it were a tear in the fabric of reality itself. As I blinked, hoping it would vanish, but it remained, its presence, a physical weight that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I tried to convince myself it was a hallucination, a product of my exhaustion and the stress of living in such a tormented household, but the figure didn't move its gaze, if it had eyes, boring into me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I turned away, pulling the covers over my head, my heart pounding as I whispered to myself that it wasn't real, that I was safe. But sleep brought no refuge. I slipped into a nightmare, the room transforming into a labyrinth of shadows, the figure now a full-fledged demon, its form towering over me, its eyes burning with an unholy light. I ran to wake my sister, but the demon blocked me, its massive frame filling the doorway, its voice a low growl that reverberated in my chest. I fled to my mother's room, pounding on her door, my screams echoing through the house, but she opened the door with a look of indifference, dismissing my cries as childish fears. The demon advanced, its steps slow and deliberate, its presence suffocating as it closed the distance between us. I ran to the bathroom, my heart pounding as I locked the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stared into the mirror, my reflection pale and distorted, and then I saw it. a flame flickering to life in the glass, its glow casting eerie shadows on the walls, the light growing brighter until it burned my eyes. I stumbled back the door to my room now, my only escape, but it wouldn't budge, trapping me in the hallway as the demon's shadow loomed closer. I banged on the door, my fists bruised and aching, until it finally gave way. And as I stumbled inside, my night lamp exploded in a shower of sparks, the room plunging into darkness. My night lamp, it had actually exploded. The shattered pieces scattered across the floor, my curtains torn from the wall, as if ripped down by an unseen force. The fabric crumpled in a heap. I woke with a start, my body drenched in sweat, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The room felt different now, the stench less overpowering, the darkness less oppressive, but the terror that gripped me was unshakable. I sat up, my eyes darting around the room searching for the figure, but it was gone, leaving behind only the wreckage of my lamp and the torn curtains. I also noticed that the room door wouldn't close anymore, its frame warped, as if something had forced it out of alignment, the hinges creaking as I tried to push it shut. Emily was barely able to move, her exhaustion and bruises more pronounced than ever. Her body slumped against the bed, as if drained of all energy. Lily, with the innocence of a child, spoke of a black fairy that had played with me in the night, her words sending a chill through me. My 5-year-old sister said that she saw me, her voice soft but certain as she described the figure, a flying black fairy that had scared her so much she'd closed her eyes and prayed. Her words confirmed what I'd feared. What I'd seen was no dream, no hallucination, but something real, something that had invaded our space. Its presence felt by all of us in different ways. I stayed awake until dawn, my body trembling, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. The days that followed were a blur of fear and uncertainty, the room a constant reminder of that night's terrors. The knocking on the walls, the strange incidents, like my mother's sudden choking episode during dinner, only deepened my dread. Emily's condition continued to deteriorate, her connection to the unseen presence growing stronger, her words and actions no longer her own. It wasn't until years later, after I'd moved out, that I learned of the exorcism that saved her. I heard that my cousin, who was diagnosed schizophrenic, underwent a ritual that banished her torment, and Emily followed the darkness lifting from her life as if it had never been. The smell vanished. The room returned to a semblance of normalcy, but the memory of that night remains a scar on my soul that refuses to fade. 3. I'm still a bit of an agnostic despite what I witnessed, but the experience reshaped my understanding of the world, leaving me to wonder if the darkness we faced was truly gone, or if it's still out there, waiting for another chance to return. The rooftop intruder. As a child, I thought the creaks and groans of our old house were just part of its charm, until the night those sounds turned into footsteps on the roof, a chilling reminder that we weren't as safe as we thought. Alone with my sisters and cousins, we heard the unmistakable noise of someone, or something, moving above us, each thud sending a jolt of fear through our young hearts. We just kept hearing noises coming from the roof like walking, and what started as a quiet evening turned into a nightmare that would haunt me for years. Our house stood at the edge of a quiet neighborhood, a 2-story structure with a boxy shape and a flat roof that always seemed to catch the wind just right, making it groan like a living thing's. It was a 2-story box house with a flat roof. Its front porch, a small square with its own flat, covering a perfect spot for climbing. If you were brave enough, or foolish enough, to try. I was 7, left to the care of my oldest sister, who was barely 11, along with my other sister and 2 cousins. All of us girls, our ages clustered between 7 and 11. My sister, charge of babysitting us. Her authority, a fragile thing in the face of the unknown, but we trusted her to keep us safe while our parents were away for the evening. We were inside, sprawled across the living room floor with a board game or a pile of dolls. I can't quite recall what we were playing, but I remember the warmth of the lamp casting a soft glow over us, the air filled with our giggles and chatter. Then a sound broke through our laughter, a heavy thud from above, followed by the unmistakable rhythm of footsteps pacing across the roof. At first we thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat. But the noises grew louder, more deliberate, accompanied by the faint clatter of what sounded like pebbles tumbling down the downspouts. We thought of a squirrel or something, but it just kept happening. The sounds too rhythmic, too human to be dismissed as mere wildlife. My oldest sister Sarah froze her eyes wide as she looked toward the ceilings. "What if someone climbed the tree?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she pointed to the massive oak that loomed beside the house, its branches stretching dangerously close to the roof. We knew that there was roof access, a point in the bedroom that I shared with one of my sisters, a small hatch that led to the attic, and out onto the roof, a vulnerability we'd never considered until that moment. The thought of someone up there, someone who could get inside, sent a wave of panic through us. We huddled together, our game forgotten, our breaths shallow, as we listened to the footsteps pacing above us each step, a reminder of how alone we were. Sarah, trying to take charge, despite her own fear, came up with a plan. She sent my other sister, Ellie, and our cousin Mia across the street to the corner store, instructing them to look up at the roof on their way back to see if they could spot anyone. My older sister told my other sister and one of my other cousins to walk across the street, their small figures disappearing into the dusk as they crossed the empty gravel parking lot, their footsteps crunching softly in the stillness. We waited, our hearts pounding, the silence in the house now deafening, without the distraction of their presence. When Ellie and Mia returned, they burst through the door, their faces pale, their voices trembling as they recounted what they'd seen. Looked up and saw a guy in a brightly colored crop top, the kind that was all the rage back then, crouched on the roof, his eyes fixed on them with an intensity that made their blood run cold. Sarah's face drained of color, and she bolted to the neighbor's house, hoping to use their deck for a better view. But the man was gone, vanished into the shadows, as if he'd never been there. She called the police, her voice shaking as she explained what had happened. But when they arrived, their skepticism was palpable. I don't think that they believed a word that we said. Their dismissive tone cutting through our fear, their insistence that we were just imaginative children making up stories for attention. They refused to search the house properly, instead ordering us, 5 terrified girls, to go upstairs and check for the intruder ourselves. 5 little girls from ages 7 to 11 sent upstairs, scared out of our minds, our tears falling as we clung to each other. The thought of that man hiding somewhere in our home, a nightmare we couldn't escape. We crept up the stairs, our footsteps hesitant, our whispers barely audible, as we searched the bedroom with the roof access, expecting to find him lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. No one hiding in the closets, no sign of intrusion. Just the eerie silence of the house and the lingering fear that he was still out there, watching us. The police left us alone, their departure a cold reminder of how little they cared, their refusal to take us seriously, leaving us vulnerable in a house that suddenly felt far too big, far too exposed. We were so scared to be left home with this guy out there, our imaginations running wild as we pictured him hiding on the roof, waiting for the right moment to strike. We huddled in the living room, the lamp now a flickering beacon of safety. Our whispers filled with fear as we debated what to do next. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind made us jump, our eyes darting to the windows, expecting to see his face pressed against the glass. When our mother finally returned, we ran to her, our voices overlapping as we poured out the story of the man on the roof, our fear spilling over like a dam. Breakings? She listened, her expression shifting from confusion to concern as she took in our tear-streaked faces, our trembling hands clutching at her. My mom explained to us that there was a lock on the roof access, a small comfort that did little to ease our terror. But she went to check anyway, her flashlight cutting through the darkness as she stepped outside. What she found confirmed our fears. Fresh footprints in the dirt, deep and deliberate, leading from the roof to the porch and into the flower beds. A trail that proved someone had been there, someone who had fled into the night. My mother's anger was a force of nature. Her fury at the police's negligence, burning bright as she marched us to the station the next day, demanding answers. We were all separated and interviewed, our stories consistent, despite the officers' attempts to find discrepancies. Their skepticism giving way to grudging acknowledgement as my mother's wrath forced them to listen. But the man was never found. His identity and intentions, a mystery that lingered like a dark cloud over our childhood. We never found out who the guy was or why he was there. But the question that haunted us most was whether he knew we were alone, 5 young girls in a house with a roof. He could access a vulnerability that could have turned our fear into something far worse. The memory of that night remains a chilling reminder of how close we came to danger, a shadow that never fully left us. The Pale Watcher. As a boy cutting grass in my grandparents' yard, I thought the summer breeze was the only thing I'd feel, until I locked eyes with a pale figure whose black, hollow gaze froze me in place, a moment that would mark the beginning of a lifetime of eerie encounters. From that day on, the Pale Watchers followed me. Their silent presence, a constant shadow across my years, appearing in the most unexpected places with an intent I could never decipher. She was all white and had the darkest eyes that I'd ever seen, a sight that haunted me through childhood and into my adult life, a mystery that refused to fade. I was just a kid, spending a sunny afternoon at my grandparents' house, the hum of the lawnmower, a steady rhythm as I worked through the sprawling yard. My grandfather had always taken pride in his garden, a patchwork of flower beds and vegetable patches that stretched out toward the house. Its centerpiece, a massive window he'd recently installed, a towering pane of glass that reflected the golden light. The window itself was around maybe 3 foot wide and 7 foot tall, a perfect frame for the view of the house, its size making the interior feel both grand and exposed. I was halfway through the lawn, the scent of freshly cut grass filling the air, when I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, as if someone were watching me. I glanced up and there she was, a tall, slender figure standing inside the house framed by that giant window. Her skin was unnaturally white, almost translucent, and her eyes were voids of black. No whites, no pupils, just an endless darkness that seemed to pull me in. I stopped and we looked at each other, the moment stretching into an eternity. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into those hollow sockets. Then, in an instant, she was gone, vanishing as if she'd never been there, leaving me standing in the yard, the lawnmower idling, my heart pounding with a fear I couldn't name. Years later, the memory of that figure lingered, a shadow that seemed to follow me through my childhoods. I'd moved into my own room, opting for a futon over a traditional bed, its low frame giving the space a cozy feel, despite the unease that often crept in at night. I slept in a really blacked-out room, no lights, and kept the windows covered with thick plastic shower curtains, a habit I'd developed to block out the world and create a cocoon of darkness. But one night, that darkness was shattered by a sound, a faint tapping like something small being tossed across the room. The noise growing louder until it culminated in a sharp strike against my old box-style TV. The screen flickered to life, static illuminating the room in a ghostly glow. The sudden light, a stark contrast to the pitch black I'd cultivated. I sat up, my heart racing as I fumbled to turn off the TV. The static hissing in the silence like a whispered warnings. I tried to convince myself it was a glitch, an old appliance acting up, but the unease lingered, a feeling that something had caused it, something unseen. Not long after I woke to a faint glow in my room, a soft light that shouldn't have been there. Given my blackout setup, I pulled the covers back, my breath shallow, and there he was. A child, pale as the woman I'd seen years before, standing at the foot of my futon. There is a kid just like the old woman, all white, black eyes. His gaze fixed on me, those hollow sockets staring with an intensity that made my skin crawl. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, then slowly faded into the darkness, leaving the room cold and silent once more. My grandmother, a deeply spiritual woman, had always been my confidant in these matters. She kept sage bundles hung on the walls of her home, their earthy scent a constant presence. And when I told her about these encounters, she listened with a calmness that both reassured and unsettled me. She told me that white spirits are good spirits, advising me to avoid them, but not to fear them, her words a balm to my rattled nerves. I wanted to believe her, to think that these pale watchers meant no harm, but their presence never felt comforting. It felt like a warning, a silent observation that followed me into my teenage years. At my grandmother's house, where I often stayed overnight, I encountered the woman again. I was walking down the hallway, the faint sound of my grandmother's snoring drifting from her room. When I passed the spare bedroom, the door was ajar, and inside the room was bathed in an unnatural light, a soft glow that illuminated the figure sitting on the edge of the bed. The same woman from experience, and is sitting on the end of the bedhead, turned staring at me, her black eyes fixed on me, her expression unreadable, but tinged with a sadness that made my chest ache. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, and then bolted down the hall, my heart pounding as I glanced back to find her gone. The room dark once more. I never told my grandmother about that encounter, a decision born from a mix of fear and a strange sense of protectiveness. I believed, as I still do, that the woman was watching over her, a guardian of sorts, her presence tied to the house in ways I couldn't understand. I believe that whoever she is perhaps watching over her, or something guarding my grandma. Her silent vigil a comfort to my grandmother, even if it terrified me. The encounters slowed after that, replaced by sporadic noises over the years. Random sounds in the night my name called, in a voice I didn't recognize. But nothing as vivid as those early experiences, until I was an adult with a family of my own. Now married with children, I'd settled into a new home, a cozy house that should have been a fresh start. But the pale watchers followed me, their presence a quiet undercurrent in my life first. We have since bought a house and gotten a dog, a loyal companion whose reactions often mirrored my own unease. Late at night while my family slept, I'd be folding laundry or tidying up the house, silent except for the hum of the dryer. Then, without warning, a sound would shatter the stillness. A loud banging at the laundry room door, a violent rhythm that echoed through the house. I'd investigate, my pulse racing, but find nothing. The door swinging open to reveal an empty room. Moments later, it would slam shut again, the noise resuming as if something were trying to break through. My dog sensed it too, her ears perking up, her body tense as she stared in the direction of the noise. her low growl a confirmation that I wasn't imagining things. I've become accustomed to hearing noises and looking at the dog to see if she acknowledged it as well, her reactions a mirror to my own unease. On some nights, I'd hear a child's laughter, a soft giggle drifting from the kitchen. The sound so clear, it sent a shiver down my spine. My dog would react, her head tilting toward the sound, her eyes wide with alertness. But when I'd check, the kitchen would be empty, the laughter fading into silence. I decided to confront the past, returning to my mother's house during a family visit, in my old room. I spoke aloud, addressing the child I'd seen years before, asking for its help to cleanse my home of the darkness that lingered there. I said, "Hey, ghost kid, if you're still here, I could use your help at my house." A plea born from desperation, a hope that the pale watcher I'd once feared could now be an ally. Since that day, the disturbances in my home have stopped. The laughter and noises replaced by a quiet peace. But I still catch glimpses of that child in the corner of my eye, a silent guardian ensuring the darkness stays at bay. The shadow in the woods, in the heart of a South London park, where ancient woods whispered secrets through their leaves. A childhood game turned into a nightmare when I spotted a figure watching us from the shadows, a figure that brought a chilling urban legend to life. My friends and I thought we were safe, laughing and weaving daisy chains, but the sight of a man bare and unashamed, staring at us with unsettling intent, shattered our innocence in an instant. Me and my friends would go to the park about 5 minutes away from the school, and on that fateful day, the woods revealed a darkness we'd never forget. Never. The park was our sanctuary, a green oasis just a short walk from our school, a place where we'd escape the monotony of lessons to bask in the freedom of youth. The park was in a seam of ancient woods, its borders a tangle of old oaks and brambles that seemed to hold stories older than the city itself. At its center lay a wide rectangular lawn, a vibrant green space surrounded by dense woodland. On 3 sides, a natural fortress that felt both protective and foreboding. On one edge of the lawn, a playground stood, its swings and slides, a haven for children enclosed by tall metal railings that separated it from the wilder parts of the park. The grassy green had a children's playground on the right-hand side, a place where we'd spend hours weaving daisy chains, giggling about crushes, and dreaming of the future. That day, the sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the park as we gathered by the tire swing, its rubber creaking softly under our weight. My best friends, Clara and Elise, were with me. Our school uniforms rumpled from a day of classes, our laughter echoing through the playground as we shared stories and secrets. The air was warm, the scent of blooming flowers, mingling with the earthy aroma of the woods. A perfect afternoon that felt like a stolen moment of joy. But as I glanced toward the trees, a flicker of movement caught my eye, a subtle shift in the shadows that made my stomach tighten with unease. I stepped closer to the railings, my curiosity outweighing my caution, peering into the dense woodland that bordered the playground. The trees formed a natural clearing, a small open space where the light filtered through the canopy, illuminating a massive oak tree that stood like a sentinel at its center. The woodland had a kind of opening in it, at the center of which stood a large oak tree, its gnarled branches creating a stage-like setting, the dappled sunlight playing across the ground. And there, in the middle of that stage, stood a man, his skin pale, his body bare, his eyes fixed on us with a hunger that made my blood run cold. I froze my breath, catching in my throat as I took in the sight of him. A man, maybe in his 30s, standing unashamedly naked in the clearing, his gaze locked on us with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I realized that right in the middle of the stage was a young man stood staring at us. His presence, a stark violation of the innocence we'd felt moments before. My friends noticed my stillness and followed my gaze, their laughter dying as they saw him, their gasps sharp in the quiet air. Clara grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin, and Elise let out a muffled cry, her hand flying to her mouth as we stood transfixed, unable to look away from the man, who seemed to revel in our fear. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, his actions crude and deliberate, a silent threat that made my stomach churn with dread. We bolted our feet, pounding against the ground as we ran from the playground, the metal railings clanging behind us as we pushed through the gate. They grabbed me, pulled me out of my shock and out of the park, and we ran home, our school bags bouncing against our backs, our breaths coming in ragged gasps as we fled through the park, the woods a blur of green and brown at the edge of my vision. We didn't stop until we reached Clara's house, slamming the door behind us, our hearts racing as we collapsed onto the couch, our voices overlapping as we tried to make sense of what we'd seen. We didn't call the police. Back then, we didn't have mobile phones to capture evidence or call for help, and the idea of telling an adult felt too daunting, too real. We didn't tell the police, and that was pretty much the end of the matter, our fear bottled up inside us, a secret we kept to ourselves as we tried to move on. But the memory of that man lingered, a dark stain on our childhood, a reminder of how quickly safety could turn to danger. We stopped going to the park after that. Our once beloved sanctuary now tainted by the shadow of what we'd witnessed. Our laughter replaced by a quiet unease that followed us into our teenage years. Years later, the incident still haunts me, a question that gnaws at the edges of my mind. Who was that man, and what became of him? I always wonder if that man went on to do anything worse. The thought a heavy weight in my chest, a fear that he might have hurt others. His actions, a prelude to something far darker. The woods of South London hold many secrets, and though we escaped that day, the memory of his gaze remains a chilling reminder of the dangers that lurk just beyond the safety of the playground. Echoes above the morgue. In the sterile silence of a hospital supply room, where the faint hum of fluorescent lights was my only companion, I thought I could escape the shadows of the night, until a face black as night with eyes like burning white coals peered at me from behind a shelf, its gaze a chilling promise of something beyond the living. I'd always dismissed ghost stories as the stuff of overactive imaginations, but as the lights dimmed and objects fell, without reason I felt the icy grip of fear tighten around my heart. The supply room is located somewhere above the old morgue, of which the entrance has been bricked over. And in that forsaken space, I learned that some things refuse to stay buried. I worked the graveyard shift at a hospital in Maine, a sprawling complex of white corridors and beeping machines, my role confined to the supply room, a cavernous space filled with shelves of medical equipment, its walls echoing with the quiet of the night threes. I work in a large storeroom. Maine, in a hospital, hours stretching from dusk to dawn, a solitary job that suited my introverted nature. I'd always been a skeptic, the kind of person who scoffed at tales of the supernatural. But there was something about the supply room that unsettled me, a feeling I couldn't shake, especially after I learned its history. The room sat directly above the hospital's old morgue, a place where the dead had once been stored, its entrance sealed with bricks, as if to lock away the memories of those who'd passed through its doors. I tried to ignore the unease, drowning out my thoughts with music through my earbuds, the volume cranked high to block out the silence. But the room had a way of making itself heard. Objects would topple from shelves with no apparent cause, the clatter echoing through the space, only for me to find nothing out of place. I will hear things fall, look, and see that nothing actually fell off the shelves. the incidents piling up like whispers of something I refused to acknowledge. Then the lights began to falter, their steady glow interrupted by sudden, unexplainable dimming, a phenomenon I blamed on faulty wiring, even as a chill crept down my spine. The disturbances grew more frequent after a conversation with my friends in security, who casually mentioned the morgue's location beneath my workspace 3s. Their words lingered in my mind, a seed of doubt that blossomed into fear with each passing shift. I began to notice patterns. The lights would dim in rhythm with my movements, and once during a delivery to the postpartum ward, the bulbs in the small supply room there pulsed with an eerie cadence, the air growing heavy, as if something were watching me. It is the only small supply room that I delivered to, that I am almost always completely alone in the isolation, amplifying every sound, every flicker, until I could no longer dismiss them as coincidence. One night, as I sorted through a list of supplies, the atmosphere in the main storeroom shifted, the air growing thick with an unspoken tension. I held a clipboard, my eyes scanning the inventory, when a sudden movement caught my attention, a shadow at the edge of my vision, a flicker of something that shouldn't have been there. I swear to you that I saw a black face with white eyes peeking at me from around a shelf. Its features stark against the dim light, its hand curled around the metal pole like a child hiding behind a door frame, watching with a curiosity that felt far from innocent. I turned to face it, my heart pounding, but it vanished, slipping back into the shadows as if it had never been there, leaving me questioning my own sanity. I tried to convince myself it was exhaustion, a trick of the mind after long hours in the dim light. But the fear lingered, a cold weight in my chest that refused to lift. I rationalized and told myself that I must just be tired. But deep down, I knew I wasn't. The clarity of that face, the intensity of those eyes, was too vivid to dismiss. The incidents continued, each one more unsettling than the last. I'd hear the crash of supplies falling from shelves, only to find them untouched. The sound a taunting echo in the empty room. The lights pulsed with a rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat, their glow fading and flaring in a dance that felt deliberate, as if something were trying to get my attention. During a delivery to the postpartum ward, the air grew heavy, the lights dimming so violently I could barely see the cart in front of me. I fled the room, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The silence of the hospital corridors, a stark contrast to the chaos I'd left behind. As soon as I took my cart into the postpartum supply room, the lights began to pulse with a ferocity I'd never seen, a relentless rhythm that drove me back into the hallway, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. I asked the nurses on duty if they'd ever experienced anything similar, but their skeptical glances only deepened my isolation. Their silence, a confirmation that I was alone in this nightmare. The experiences have left me shaken, a skeptic forced to confront the possibility of something beyond the rational, a presence tied to the morgue below that refuses to rest. I've never seen or experienced anything like this in my life until now, and the uncertainty gnaws at me, a question I can't answer. Was it real, or am I losing my grip on reality? Echoes of the unseen. In the quiet of my family home, where the walls once held the warmth of our laughter, a chilling presence began to whisper my name in voices that weren't there, turning every moment of solitude into a descent into fear. It started with my father's voice calling my nickname, a name he never used, echoing through the house when I knew he was miles away. His absence, a stark contrast to the sound that haunted me. It's always my parents calling me, either at night when I'm alone or during the day, when everybody is out, and with each call, the line between reality and nightmare blurred. leaving me to question what was truly lurking within these walls. The house had always been a sanctuary, a modest two-story, nestled in a sleepy suburban neighborhood. Its faded yellow paint and creaky wooden floors, a testament to years of family life. I'd grown up here, my childhood marked by the rhythm of my parents' routines, my father working night shifts, often napping during the day, and my mother juggling her job and caring for my younger brother Ethan. But lately the comfort of home had been replaced by an unsettling tension, a feeling that something was watching, waiting its presence announced by the voices that called out to me when I least expected it. It began one afternoon as I scrubbed dishes in the kitchen, the scent of lemon dish soap filling the air, the sunlight streaming through the window above the sink. I was alone, or so I thought, when a voice cut through the silence, my father's voice, deep and familiar, calling out, "Audi," a nickname I hadn't heard from him in years. I heard my nickname called Audi in my dad's voice, the sound so clear, so real, that I dropped the sponge, my hands trembling as I turned toward the hallway. My parents' room was just around the corner, close enough that I could peek in and see their bed. But I knew he wasn't home. His car wasn't in the driveway, and he was at work, as always. Still, I checked my footsteps, hesitant as I approached their room, only to find it empty, the bed neatly made, the silence mocking my racing heart. The incident shook me, but I brushed it off, convincing myself it was my imagination, a trick of the mind, after a long day. But the voices didn't stop. They grew more frequent, more insistent, always calling my name when I was alone. It sounds just like them, my parents' voices echoing through the house, but the names they used were wrong. Nicknames I'd earned from friends, not family names they'd never used for me. The dissonance was unnerving, a creeping dread that settled in my bones, making every creak of the house, every whisper of the wind, feel like a summons from something I couldn't see. The voices followed me through the days, a constant companion that turned my home into a place of unease. I'd be in my room buried in homework when my mother's voice would call out, asking why I was yelling for her, her tone sharp with confusion. I'd look up, startled, my pencil frozen mid-sentence, and reply that I hadn't called her at all. The amount of times that my mom has come to my room wondering why I'm calling her name was staggering. Each incident adding to the growing sense of dread that something was terribly wrong. My parents began to notice it too. They'd hear me or Ethan calling them using names. We never used their voices so real. They'd rush to check on us, only to find us silent, asleep, or miles away. One night I heard Ethan's voice, a desperate cry that pierced the darkness, pulling me from sleep with a jolt. I ran to his room, my heart pounding, expecting to find him in distress. But he was fast asleep, his small chest rising and falling peacefully. I checked on him, and he was fast asleep. The silence of his room a stark contrast to the scream that still echoed in my ears. The realization hit me like a wave. Whatever was calling us wasn't human, wasn't part of our family, but something else. Something that knew us well enough to mimic our voices, to use our names in ways that cut deep. The most terrifying moment came when I woke to my full name being called, right in my ear. My father's voice filled with an anger I'd never heard from him. I woke up to my name being called, the sound so close, so real, that I could almost feel his breath on my skin. I jumped up, my door still closed, the house silent except for the pounding of my heart. And I knew I was alone. No one was home to call my name, to fill the air with that chilling rage. The voices weren't just unsettling, they were malicious, and the more I tried to ignore them, the worse it became. If you don't physically go to check what you heard, then just get these terrible headaches, a throbbing pain that would build in my skull, a punishment for refusing to acknowledge the unseen presence that demanded my attention, the realization that something was mimicking us, using our voices to lure us to toy with us, turned my home into a place of fortuitous. It's like whatever it is begging for attention by impersonating us. A cruel game that left me questioning my sanity, my safety, and the very walls that had once held our family together. I just wanted it to stop, to reclaim the peace we'd lost. But the voices persisted, a haunting reminder that some things refuse to be ignored. The hunter in the wilderness, deep in the Romanian wilderness where the shadows of ancient forests hold secrets darker than the night our dream camping trip turned into a nightmare, when a man from the train, a man with a dog named Killer, emerged from the bushes, his intentions as chilling as the wind that howled through the trees. We thought we'd escaped danger by leaving the crowded train behind. But as the firelight flickered and the woods came alive with eerie sounds, we realized we'd been followed, hunted by a predator who knew exactly where we'd be. I took the honesty route, and I'm judging myself for that. To this day, a mistake that turned our adventure into a fight for survival in the heart of Căzăia National Park. Romania had always been a land of stark contrasts, its landscapes breathtaking with rolling hills and dense forests. But its reputation shadowed by whispers of danger, a place where people could vanish without a trace. My parents were legitimately afraid for me, and were against the idea of going camping. Their voices heavy with concern as they spoke of kidnappings, murders, and disappearances that plagued the countryside. I understood their fears, but the call of the wild was too strong to resist. I'd always dreamed of sleeping under the stars, of waking to the sound of birds in a forest, untouched by the chaos of city life. 3S. So I lied, telling them we'd be staying in a hotel near Căzăia National Park, a deception that eased their worries, but set the stage for a journey I'd never forget. My boyfriend Alex and I packed our bags with everything we'd need for a week in the wild: tents, sleeping bags, cooking gear, our backpacks weighing heavy as we boarded a train from Bucharest. We had to travel from Bucharest to this park, which is around 200 kilometers. The journey, a blur of anticipation as the city faded into the distance, replaced by the rugged beauty of the Romanian countryside. The train was a chaotic symphony of voices and footsteps, every compartment packed with travelers, except for ours. The train was overly crowded, with the exception of our train compartment being completely empty. A rare stroke of luck that made me smile as I settled into my seat, imagining the quiet hours ahead, just the two of us, planning our adventure. But that solitude was short-lived. A man entered his presence commanding, accompanied by a German shepherd, so still, so perfect, it looked almost like a statue, its eyes fixed on its owner with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. I've always had a soft spot for animals, their warmth a comfort in any situation. But this dog was different. Its name, as the man revealed, was Killer, a word that sent a chill through me. He told me that his dog's name is Killer, his voice flat, his explanation chilling. The dog was trained to kill a predator honed for violence, its obedience to the man's every command, a testament to its deadly purpose. The man's demeanor was as cold as his dog's gaze. His responses to my attempts at conversation curt his focus solely on the animal as he gripped its collar, the metal clicking softly under his touch. I tried to make small talk, asking about Killer's training, hoping to ease the tension of the long journey. But the man offered little beyond the dog's name and purpose. The dog is trained to kill. It's the only thing that he likes, and he's good at it. He said his words blunt, his eyes distant, as if reliving a memory I didn't want to know. I forced a smile, my mind racing with thoughts of the woods we were heading to, wondering if this man and his dog were hunters. Their presence, a harbinger of the dangers my parents had warned me about. As the train rolled on, the man's knowledge of our destination grew unsettling. He mentioned Kazaya National Park by name. His guess too accurate, too precise, considering we'd only spoken of it at the station long before he'd joined us. The guy out of nowhere asks if we're traveling to the national park, his voice cutting through the silence, his eyes gleaming with a strange intensity as he spoke of the park's trails, its wildlife, and its hidden gems. He told us about a beautiful monastery right at the bottom of the mountain that we needed to climb, to get to his words, painting a picture of a serene retreat. But the way he gripped Killer's collar, the dog remaining motionless, sent a chill through me. I confirmed our destination, eager to learn more. But the decision to be honest with this stranger would haunt me a mistake that would unravel the safety we thought we'd found in the wilderness. When we reached our stop, the man and his dog vanished as quickly as they'd appeared. Their absence a relief that was short-lived. The man and the dog were no longer there, but not just that. Also, his luggage was gone, a disappearing act that left me unsettled. But I pushed the thought aside, too, excited for our first camping experience to dwell on it. We started walking with our backpacks on US 10 kilos each, the weight a small price to pay for the freedom of the wilderness. The path to the park led us through a tunnel carved into the mountain, its stone walls damp and cool. The light at the far end, a beacon of hope as we emerged into the forest beyond. The forest greeted us with a mix of beauty and foreboding, its ancient trees stretching toward the sky, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the sunlight into a soft, dappled glow. As we walked, a faint sound reached us, a desperate cry, the unmistakable sound of an animal in distress. Against Alex's protests, I followed the noise, my heart breaking, as I found a small puppy, its fur matted with dirt, lying on the ground, as if it had been struck. In the middle of the road, I see a chubby puppy with lots of white and brown circles on its butt, its big eyes pleading for help as it whimpered softly, its body trembling with fear. We named him Milo, his clumsy run a balm to the tension of the journey, his presence a small miracle in the midst of our unease. Not long after, we found another pup, a shivering little girl we pulled from the icy river nearby. Her body cold and frail, her survival a testament to resilience. 3. We find another puppy though, probably a sister, which we dragged from the nearby river. Her wet fur clinging to her skin as she looked up at us with grateful eyes. We named her Luna, and with 2 new companions in tow, we continued our trek, passing a monastery nestled at the base of the mountain, its golden domes gleaming in the sunlight. We passed by the monastery. The man in the train mentioned its gardens, a serene contrast to the rugged terrain. But the priest's refusal to let us enter with the puppies forced us to move on our path, leading us deeper into the forest. The puppies, though adorable, were a handful, their dramatic protests echoing through the woods whenever we set them down to walk on their own. These puppies were 2 tiny little brats, because the second that you would put them down and force them to walk on their own, they would slam their butts on the ground, their cries a mix of comedy and frustration as we carried them, our backpacks heavy against our shoulders. We hiked until the sun began to dip below the horizon, the air growing cooler as we searched for a place to camp, our steps slowing with the weight of the day. The forest seemed to close in around us, its shadows lengthening its silence, a canvas for the sounds that would soon haunt us. We set up camp near a small religious outpost, a simple structure with a cross atop its roof. its walls adorned with faded icons and a tattered Bible, a place meant to bring peace to the wilderness. There was an icon inside, and a Bible with pages ripped from it and the pages marked with scribbled names, and a chilling message in red ink, "I will find you." I dismissed it as a prank, a childish attempt to scare travelers, and focused on building our camp, pitching the tent, starting a fire, and feeding the puppies who curled up beside us, their warmth a comfort as the forest darkened around us. The fire cast a soft glow over our small clearing, its crackling a steady rhythm against the growing silence of the night. But that silence wouldn't last. As the stars emerged, the woods came alive with sounds that sent shivers down my spine. Rustling leaves, snapping twigs, and a low guttural sound that seemed to circle our tent, a predator's warning in the stillness. My boyfriend always kept the fire up every hour, his efforts a desperate attempt to keep the night at bay. But the forest seemed to press closer, its whispers, a haunting melody that filled me with dread. I unzipped the tent to let the puppies out, their small bodies shivering as they relieved themselves. But as I brought them back inside, a new sound reached us, a low guttural noise from behind the tent, a sound that made Alex sit up, his eyes wide with alarm. We peered through this tent flap, the fire's glow casting long shadows across the clearing, and saw a shape emerge from the bushes, a hunched figure, its movements unnatural, its form a blend of man and beast. A dark, bent-over silhouette comes out of it, and half inside the bush, and sort of half outside of it, stares at us, its eyes glinting in the firelight, a metallic sound ringing out as it shook its head. A chilling echo of the man we'd met on the train. Alex reignited the fire, the flames roaring to life, and the creature retreated, its form disappearing into the woods, leaving us trembling in its wake, our hearts pounding with the fear of what might come next. The night stretched on, each moment a test of our courage, as we sat huddled in the tent. Puppies nestled between us, their soft snores a small comfort against the terror that gripped us. I couldn't sleep, my mind replaying the events of the day. The man on the train, his dog, the eerie message in the Bible, and now the creature that had stalked us in the darkness. I kept watch through a small opening in the tent, my eyes fixed on the bush where the creature had vanished, every rustle of the leaves sending my heart racing, my breath shallow as I waited for the next sign of danger. Then a new horror emerged, a human head rising slowly from the foliage, its skin pale, its body bare, as it stepped into the moonlight. The same man from the train, his dog, nowhere in sight. I look at the man with horror, because I recognize him, his intent clear as he approached our tent, dismantling our fire with deliberate precision. His movements, a silent threat that sent my heart racing. He worked methodically, pulling branches and rocks from the flames, extinguishing the only barrier between us and the darkness. His presence, a looming threat, just meters from our tent. I clutched the puppies closer, their warmth a small comfort against the fear that gripped me, my mind racing with the realization that we were not safe, that this man had followed us or found us, his intentions as dark as the night that surrounded us. The man's actions were deliberate, each movement calculated to instill fear, his pale form illuminated by the moonlight as he worked to extinguish our fire, leaving us vulnerable in the darkness. I whispered to Alex, my voice trembling, urging him to do something, anything, to scare the man away. But we were frozen, our fear a paralyzing force that kept us rooted to the spot. The puppies stirred their small bodies, sensing the tension, but they remained quiet, as if they too understood the danger that lurked just outside our tent. The man finally retreated his form, disappearing into the bush bit by bit, until only his head remained, his expression twisted into a ghostly grimace that sent a chill through me. We stayed awake until dawn, reigniting the fire with trembling hands. Our fear, a living nothing as we waited for the light to chase away the shadows, knowing we couldn't stay another night in that cursed forest. We packed our stuff, and we got the heck out of there, abandoning our plans for a 4-day camping trip. After just one night, the risk too great to ignore, we hiked back through the forest, the monastery's golden domes a distant memory, as we left Kazaya National Park behind its beauty, overshadowed by the danger we'd faced, the puppies now. Our loyal companions stayed close, their presence a reminder of the small miracles that had punctuated our nightmare, Milo and Luna. Their names a symbol of the light we'd found in the darkness. The journey back to Bucharest was a blur of exhaustion and relief. The weight of our backpacks, a small burden, compared to the fear that had weighed on us through the nights. We barely spoke, our minds replaying the events of the previous hours. The man's cold demeanor on the train, the eerie message in the Bible, the creature in the bushes, and finally, the man himself, his pale form, a haunting specter in the moonlight. I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd narrowly escaped something far worse, that the man's intentions had been far darker than we'd realized his presence in the woods, a deliberate act of pursuit rather than a coincidence. When we finally reached the safety of the city, I called my parents, my voice trembling as I recounted the ordeal, their anger at my deception overshadowed by their relief that we were safest. They insisted we never return to the wilderness. Their warnings, now a reality I couldn't ignore, a lesson learned through fear and survival. We had planned a 4-day camping trip, and this experience made us give up. After the first night, a decision born from the terror of that night, a memory that would linger like a shadow over every future adventure. Milo and Luna became a permanent part of our lives. Their playful barks, a reminder of the light that had emerged from the darkness. But the man from the train, the hunter in the wilderness, remains a mystery, a specter that haunts my dreams, a reminder of the dangers that lurk in the places we least expect. The charismatic trap, what started as a quest for community at university, turned into a chilling descent into manipulation. As a charismatic stranger named Joel drew me into a group that promised spiritual growth, but demanded my soul in return. I thought I'd found a safe space to explore my faith, but as the meetings grew more intense, I realized I was being pulled into something far darker, a web of control that threatened to unravel everything I held dear. I was in my first semester of university, a time of new beginnings that quickly became a lesson in the dangers of trusting the wrong people. The city was a sprawling maze of concrete and noise, a far cry from the quiet town where I'd grown up, its streets buzzing with energy as I navigated my new life as a university student. I just graduated from college, eager to carve my own path to discover who I was, beyond the familiarity of my childhood. The daily commute, an hour and a half each way, gave me plenty of time to reflect, but it also left me isolated my longtime friends at the same university, too busy with their own schedules to connect regularly. I have longtime friends who go to the same facility as me, but at that time, our schedules just wouldn't always line up, leaving me to wander the campus alone, yearning for a sense of belonging in this unfamiliar world. I was extroverted by nature, the kind of person who thrived on connection, but forming new friendships felt daunting, each attempt draining me more than I expected. I'd made friends in college before, but those relationships often faded my busy schedule and tendency to prioritize established connections, leading to inevitable ghosting on both sides. I really just don't find myself prioritizing people who I feel like aren't as important to me as others. A truth I wasn't proud of, but one that shaped my approach to new relationships. Still, I craved a community, a group that could fill the void of loneliness that could help me expand my horizons and explore the new experiences I'd come to the city to find. One afternoon, as I walked out of the campus Starbucks, a decaf coffee in hand, I was on the phone with my fiancée, her voice a comforting anchor in the chaos of my day. I was heading to class, my steps quickening as I navigated the underground passageways that connected the library to the main academic building, when a voice broke through my focus. A short, stout guy with a thick brown beard and a worn cap stood in my path, his eyes meeting mine with a disarming warmth. "Hey, sorry to bother you," he said, his tone calm and charismatic. "You look like a busy guy, but I was wondering, do you mind doing a survey about religion? It's for one of my classes." He asked me something in a very charismatic and calm tone, and though I should have kept walking, something about his demeanor drew me in a spark of curiosity. Igniting within me, I hesitated, my phone still pressed to my ear. My fiancée's voice, a faint murmur as I considered the man's request. Religion had been on my mind lately. I'd been questioning my own beliefs, particularly drawn to Christianity, intrigued by the idea of formal institutions and their role in spiritual growth. So I agreed, nodding as I ended my call. The man introducing himself as Joel, with a smile that felt both genuine and calculated. He then introduced himself as Joel, guiding me through a brief survey about religious affiliations and perspectives, his questions thoughtful, his demeanor engaging. When we finished, he mentioned a small group of students like me who were planning to meet and discuss various religions, a chance to gain new insights and build a community on campus. The prospect of finding friends and exploring my spirituality was too tempting to resist, so I gave him my phone number, eager to join what I thought would be a diverse discussion groups. I gave him my phone number after he asked for it, and he promised to contact me soon. His enthusiasm infectious as I continued to class, a flicker of excitement in my chest. The first meeting took place in a crowded common area on campus, the hum of student chatter, a backdrop as Joel greeted me warmly, introducing me to a group of other members who seemed genuinely kind. I sat down in a very crowded place with seats at our school facility, the atmosphere welcoming, but I was taken aback when the discussion focused solely on Christianity, a stark contrast to the broad exploration Joel had promised. Despite the discrepancy, I stayed intrigued by the group's dynamic and the friendships I began to form with 3 other guys my age, their shared interests in music and literature, a comfort in the unfamiliar settings. Joel, who now presented himself as a leader of our study group, outlined a multi-step program designed to unveil the holy power of Christianity. His words laced with a fervor that both captivated and unsettled me. I continued attending, drawn by the sense of community I'd craved. But doubts began to creep in as Joel dismissed my questions, his interpretations. Rigid, his responses lacking the open dialogue I'd expected. It felt like at times my wavering belief in what Joel was saying would be met with straight dismissal, a pattern that grew more concerning with each meeting, though I brushed it off, unwilling to lose the connections I'd made. The group became a lifeline, filling the void of loneliness with shared experiences, even leading me to a church-run event where I quit vaping, a moment of personal triumph amidst reports of mystical experiences from others. But my one-on-one conversations with Joel began to reveal a darker side to his leadership. I discussed my personal experiences and belief in my newfound religious beliefs, opening up about my spiritual journey, only for Joel to share stories that sent chills down my spine. He spoke of hearing God's voice during a retreat, insisting it was literal, not metaphorical, his eyes gleaming with a conviction that felt unhinged. He had reassured me that he literally heard God speak to him, his words unsettling his claim of direct conversations with God. A red flag. I couldn't ignore, though I didn't press him further, my discomfort growing with each revelation. After a summer marked by a debilitating injury that left me housebound, I returned to university with a renewed devotion to my faith, having leaned on prayer for strength during my recovery. I had found myself in the most religiously devoted state that I had ever been, and eager to reconnect with the community that had supported me through my first semester. But the first meeting of the new semester was different. Joel, now the center of attention, was constantly interrupted by young men offering praise, their adulation delaying our lesson, as I watched a growing unease settling in my chest. Joel, as before, was at the helm of our study session, but was now perpetually interrupted by people coming to greet him, his charm masking a control that became more apparent as the session unfolded. Joel introduced the second phase of the program, a tough level that demanded greater devotion and sacrifice, including abstaining from sex before marriage, a rule that felt intrusive, especially for those of us in committed relationships. He also began to go over the notion that sex before marriage is a sin, his tone commanding his expectations, suffocating as he insisted we prove our adherence. Dismissing those who couldn't comply, I discussed my concerns with another member, both of us feeling the weight of Joel's control, his demands clashing with the love we felt for our partners, a devotion that felt sacred despite not being formalized by marriage. The intensity of Joel's speech left me reeling his expectations, a heavy burden as we sat for a private conversation after the lesson. I shared my experiences from the summer, the way my injury had deepened my faith, but Joel's response sent a jolt of unease through me. He then went on to tell me that at times he was actually able to know things beforehand, claiming a mystical foresight that allowed him to know things about others before they spoke his words, tinged with a certainty that felt dangerous. He went further, suggesting I was primed to become a teacher in the program, a role he saw as my future within the organization, his vision for my life, a stark contrast to the autonomy I sought. Then came the revelation that shattered my trust. Joel wasn't a student at all, but a man in his mid-30s, a father and a member of an organization that recruited students to become Christians and missionaries. It also became evident that Joel was not a student at our facility. In fact, he was in his mid-30s. His initial lie about the group's purpose, a betrayal that made me question everything. The group wasn't about exploring various religions. It was a recruitment tool, a means to convert and control, and I'd been drawn in under false pretenses. The realization hit me hard, my trust in Joel crumbling as I grappled with the community I'd come to rely on, and the growing sense of manipulation at its core. School and work began to consume my time, a welcome distraction from the unease that now tainted the group. I missed a scheduled lesson, texting Joel to explain I was on the train home and had work, but his response was insistent, disregarding my commitments. I texted Joel saying, "Hey man, I actually got onto the train and forgot about our lesson." Expecting understanding, but he urged me to return his tone, commanding as he dismissed my responsibilities. He replied, "Can you get off the train? Try and get here as soon as possible." His persistence, a violation of my boundaries, his disregard for my life, a clear sign of the control he sought to exert. I refused, my annoyance growing as Joel continued to press his messages, a relentless push to bend me to his will, ignoring my clear no with a persistence that felt suffocating. He said, "Come on, man, just get off the train and come back." His words a command rather than a request. His disregard for my situation, a stark reminder of the control he'd exerted over the group. I stopped responding, turning to my fiancée for support. her unease mirroring my own as we discussed the group's impact on my life. My fiancé told me, though, that by the way that Joel was acting and with regards to the things that he said, that she was starting to become uncomfortable, her words a lifeline, as I grappled with the guilt of wanting to leave the community I'd grown to love, a community now tainted by Joel's increasingly controlling presence. The breaking point came when Joel texted about a church event, insisting I attend, despite my work schedule, claiming it was God's will for me to be there. He replied and simply said, "What? Bro, no way. You've got to come take work off and find somebody else to take your shift. God wants you there." His words, a blatant overstep, his use of divine authority, a manipulative tactic that pushed me over the edge. I texted him explaining I was done with the group, determined to pursue my own spiritual journey. But Joel's response was a long, overly kind paragraph persisting that I stay claiming God had told him I belonged there. "Threes," he replied with a long paragraph persisting in this sort of overly kind manner. His tone a mask for the control he sought to maintain his refusal to accept my decision. A clear sign of his true intentions. I told him to stop, to leave me alone, but he continued asking to meet so I could explain my decision. His persistence, a final straw that led me to block him. I decided at that moment that I needed to block him, cutting off contact to protect myself from his influence, a decision that brought relief but also guilt as I mourned the friendships I'd lost. Months later, I ran into Joel outside a pizza parlor on campus. His disarming gentleness, a stark contrast to the control. I knew he wielded his insistence that I unblock him, a reminder of the danger I'd escaped. Joel turned around to look at me and asked with this sort of disarming gentleness, "Did you block me?" His words, a calculated attempt to draw me back in. But I stood my ground, walking away with a resolve I hadn't felt before. That night, he messaged me on Instagram, still pushing to meet, and I blocked him there too, determined to sever all ties with the man who had nearly consumed my autonomy. Reflecting on the experience, I realized how close I'd come to being ensnared in something far darker than a study group. A cult, its charismatic leader using faith as a weapon to control vulnerable students. Fears. I truly believed that I was being indoctrinated into a cult. The realization a chilling one, as I thought of the other members, young men like me, who lacked the support I had in my fiancé. Their isolation making them prime targets for Joel's influence. Some had reached higher levels in the program, their lives so restricted by its rules that they seemed hollow, their openness to new experiences diminished by the fundamentalist grip of the group. My fiancé's support was my salvation. Her encouragement giving me the strength to break free, to reclaim my journey on my own terms. I'm thankful for my fiancé, who is the love of my life. Without her, I'm really not sure if I would have been strong enough to have left that group. Her clarity, a beacon in the fog of Joel's manipulation. The lesson was clear. Beware of those who seem too kind, too eager to draw you in. For their motives may be far darker than they appear. The lesson here is beware of who you let into your life, a truth I now hold close, a reminder to stand firm, to respect my own boundaries, and to never let someone else's charisma blind me to the danger beneath. The experience left me wary, a scar on my university years that shaped how I approached new relationships, a reminder of the fine line between community and controls. I often thought of the other members, those who stayed their lives increasingly dictated by Joel's rules, their potential stifled by the very group that promised liberation. There were other guys in that group who had absolutely nobody, that they had nothing, and they were prime targets for a charismatic and controlling freak. Their vulnerability a stark contrast to the support I'd found in my fiancée, a support that had saved me from a path I might not have escaped otherwise. Shadows of a broken past. In the quiet sanctuary of my grandparents' house, where my girlfriend sought refuge from a past, shadowed by her mother's addiction, an intruder shattered our peace, his presence a haunting reminder of the danger we thought we'd left behind. My girlfriend had fled her mother's home years ago, escaping a life of abuse and drugs. But when her mother's husband, a man we thought was behind bars, appeared at our door, we realized the past was never truly gone. My girlfriend's mother is a longtime heroin user, a truth that had shaped a nightmare we could never fully escape. My girlfriend Emily had endured a childhood marked by chaos. Her mother's heroin addiction, a constant storm that tore through their lives like a hurricane threes. When she lived with her mother and her mother's husband, she witnessed physical abuse and drug activity. The memories of those years etched into her soul. Nights spent hiding from the violence, the stench of drugs permeating the air, and the fear that she might not survive to see another day. At a tender age, she made the heart-wrenching decision to leave to save herself from the destruction that surrounded her, finding solace with her grandparents, whose home became a haven, a place where she could finally breathe without fear. Years later, when her mother announced she was pregnant, Emily felt a flicker of hope, a belief that perhaps her mother had finally broken free from the grip of addiction. She thought that her mother was finally clean, and despite the scars of her past, Emily chose to support her, clinging to the possibility of a new beginning for her family. But that hope was shattered when her mother overdosed while pregnant. The betrayal, a knife to the heart, that severed the fragile thread of trust between them. She decided to cut old contact at that point, a decision born from pain and necessity. A final act of self-preservation in the face of her mother's unrelenting demons. As a mandated reporter, Emily knew she couldn't stay silent when her mother's actions endangered the unborn child. My girlfriend is also a mandated reporter and reported her mother and her mother's husband to the States, her voice trembling as she made the call, knowing the environment was no place for a baby. But the worst came to pass. The baby didn't survive the tragedy. A devastating blow that left Emily grappling with grief and guilt, the details too horrific to recount. Unfortunately, the baby died. And I won't go into details about how it all happened, the loss. A silent scar that deepened the rift between Emily and her mother, a wound that time could never fully heal. The aftermath was swift. Emily's mother and her husband were arrested, charged with child endangerment, and a litany of other crimes, their lives unraveling in a courtroom as justice sought to right the wrongs they'd inflicted. My girlfriend's mother was arrested, and her mother's husband was arrested for child endangerment and other charges. The news. A bittersweet relief. A small victory in the face of so much loss. At first, the judge denied bail for both, a decision that brought a semblance of peace, a belief that they were finally safe from the chaos her mother had wrought. But that peace was fragile, shattered when we learned that her husband had been granted bail and had posted it. A revelation that came too late to prepare us for what was to come. Eventually, her husband was granted bail, in which he posted a fact we only discovered recently. The pieces of the puzzle falling into place with chilling clarity. We were at her grandparents' house, a quaint cottage nestled in a quiet neighborhood, its walls filled with the warmth of family memories. Photos of Emily as a child, her grandparents' laughter echoing through the halls, a stark contrast to the darkness she'd left behind. It was meant to be a sanctuary, a place where Emily could heal, where we could build a future free from the shadows of her past. But that illusion of safety was broken one evening, when a knock at the door turned into a nightmare. The figure of her mother's husband standing on the porch, his eyes cold and unyielding. His presence, a threat we hadn't anticipated. We didn't know this until recently, which helped us to put some of the pieces together. The realization that he'd been free, that he'd tracked us down, sending a wave of fear through us as we faced the intruder who had invaded our refuge. The ominous pursuit everywhere. My girlfriend turned a black van loomed in the shadows. Its presence, a chilling echo of the danger we thought we'd escaped after her mother's arrest, turning her daily life into a maze of fear. She'd see them at the grocery store, the gas station even parked across from her house, their tinted windows hiding the threat within. Watching her every move with an intent that made her blood run cold, my girlfriend started seeing black vans everywhere she went. A haunting pursuit that began to unravel the fragile peace she'd fought so hard to build. My girlfriend Sarah had spent her life navigating the chaos of her mother's addiction, a woman whose heroin use had torn their family apart, leaving scars that ran deep. My girlfriend's mother was arrested, and her husband was arrested for child endangerment and other charges. A culmination of years of neglect and danger that had finally caught up with them. The arrest came after Sarah, a mandated reporter, made the agonizing decision to report her mother and stepfather to the authorities, knowing the environment they'd created was no place for a child. The tragedy that followed, the loss of her unborn sibling, was a wound that refused to heal, a grief compounded by the knowledge that her actions, though necessary, had set off a chain of events she couldn't control. Initially, the court had denied bail for both her mother and stepfather, a decision that brought a fleeting sense of safety, a belief that the threat they posed was contained behind bars. But that illusion was shattered when we learned that her stepfather had been released on bail, a fact we only discovered after the pieces of a terrifying puzzle began to fall into place. Eventually, her husband was granted bail, in which he posted his freedom, a secret that had been kept from us, a revelation that explained the darkness that had begun to follow Sarah like a shadow. We didn't know this until recently, which helped us to put some of the pieces together. The truth, a cold realization that the black vans plaguing her life were no coincidence, but a deliberate act of intimidation. It started subtly. Sarah would notice the same black van at the grocery store, its tinted windows reflecting the fluorescent lights, or at the gas station parked just close enough to make her uneasy. She even started seeing them around her house, their presence a constant reminder of the danger she thought she'd left behind. At first, she dismissed it as paranoia, a natural response to the trauma of her mother's arrest and the loss that followed. But the vans grew bolder, their appearances more frequent, their proximity more threatening. She noticed that she'd see them almost every day, a pattern that turned her routine into a game of survival, each outing a test of her courage as she braced for the next sighting. The vans became a fixture in Sarah's life, their presence a relentless pressure that eroded her sense of safety, turning every corner into a potential threat. She'd leave her house for a run, her sneakers pounding the pavement, only to return and find a black van parked across the street, its engine idling, its driver hidden behind dark windows. She would leave her house to go on a run, and when she came back, there would be a black van parked across the street, the sight sending a chill down her spine, her heart racing as she hurried inside, locking the door behind her. What had begun as a suspicion grew into a terrifying reality. When one day, as she sat in her car in a parking lot, a black van pulled up beside her, its lights flashing, its window rolling down to reveal a stranger whose stare held a malice she couldn't ignore. A black van pulled up right beside her. They flashed their lights at her, rolled down their window, and just stared, the intensity of the gaze making her skin crawl. Her instincts screaming at her to flee, she drove away, her hands trembling on the steering wheel, and called me, her voice shaking as she recounted the encounter, the fear in her words a stark reminder of the danger we faced. I urged her to call the police, hoping for protection, but their response was disheartening. They couldn't act without a direct threat, advising her only to stay vigilant and report anything suspicious. The police told her that there wasn't much that they could do since there was no direct threat, a hollow reassurance that did little to ease her terror as the vans continued their pursuit, appearing at odd hours, their presence a constant menace that followed her into the night. She started noticing them at odd hours, late evenings and early mornings, their headlights cutting through the darkness like a predator's eyes. Watching, waiting. One night, the terror escalated. Sarah woke to the sound of pounding on her front door, her heart leaping into her throat as she peered out the window to see a black van parked in her driveway, its headlights glaring, illuminating the night with an eerie glow. She woke up to the sound of someone banging on her front door, the noise of violent intrusion into the silence, her fear mounting as she called the police, praying for help. But by the time they arrived, the van had vanished, leaving only the echo of its presence and the police's promise to patrol more frequently, a promise that felt empty without evidence to act upon. My girlfriend started to think that maybe this had something to do with her mother's arrest, her mind racing with the possibility that her stepfather or someone connected to him was behind this, a calculated attempt to intimidate her for reporting them to silence her as she prepared to testify against them. The black vans became a specter in Sarah's life, their relentless pursuit a source of constant stress that left her feeling trapped. Her once safe home, now a place of fears. She thinks that maybe her mother's husband or someone associated with him is trying to intimidate her because she reported them to the state, a theory that felt all too plausible, given the timing, the anger her stepfather must have felt at her actions. The uncertainty gnawed at her, each sighting of the vans, a reminder of the danger that loomed, a threat she couldn't escape. She's even started staying with me more often because she doesn't feel safe at her own house. Her nights spent in my apartment, a temporary refuge from the terror that stalked her. But even that couldn't erase the fear that followed her everywhere. We discussed our options, desperate for a solution: installing a security system, moving to a new place, anything to reclaim the safety she'd lost. We've talked about getting a security system, or maybe even moving. But each choice came with its own challenges. The cost and upheaval, a daunting prospect as we weighed the risks. Sarah's fear of testifying grew, the black vans a looming warning of what might happen if she spoke out against her mother and stepfather, the intimidation a shadow over her decisions. She's also worried that if she testifies against her mother and her husband, that this could get worse, the possibility of escalation. A weight that pressed down on her, a fear that kept her awake at night, her mind racing with what-ifs. We tried to document everything, hoping to build a case to find proof of the threat that haunted her. But the vans were elusive, their lack of distinguishing marks or visible license plates making them impossible to trace. We've been trying to document everything, just in case we need to take legal action. But each attempt felt futile, the vans disappearing before we could capture anything concrete, leaving us with nothing but fear and frustration. We really just need opinions at this stage, a plea for guidance as we navigated this nightmare, searching for a way to protect Sarah from the shadows of her past, to break free from the pursuit that threatened to consume her life. The wolf in the room. During a sleepover at my best friend's house in middle school, I felt a primal fear the moment her father walked in. An instinct that warned me I was prey in the presence of a predator, a feeling I'd never forget. Years later, sitting in a bustling mall food court, I learned the horrifying truth about that man. A revelation that turned my childhood memories into a chilling nightmare. There was one thing that I can still remember till this day. The minute that he walked in, there was a complete shift in the air, a moment that would haunt me long after I left that sketchy neighborhood behind. I had just moved away from my dad's house to live with my mom and stepdad. A man I'll call Elias, a name borrowed from a villain in one of my favorite shows because he bore an uncanny resemblance to that character. I moved away from my dad's house to live with my mom and stepdad, a decision driven by a need to escape a situation that had become unbearable. Though I'll spare the details of that struggle, my mom and Elias could only afford a small rental in a rough part of town, a neighborhood where the streets felt alive with unseen dangers, the kind of place where you learn to keep your head down and your wits sharp. My mom and her boyfriend at the time, who we'll call Elias, rented a house in a pretty sketchy neighborhood. Their limited means forcing us into a life where safety was a luxury we couldn't afford. As a result, I ended up at a rundown middle school, a place where the teachers were kind, but the location left much to be desired, exposing me to more than a few frightening situations. I went to a pretty run-down school, its crumbling walls and graffiti-covered lockers, a stark contrast to the warmth of the staff, who did their best to create a safe haven amidst the chaos. It was there that I met Brittany, a girl who quickly became my best friend, her rebellious spirit, a mirror to my own struggles. There was one girl in particular who became my best friend. Her name was Brittany, a friendship that blossomed despite the challenges we both faced. Our shared experiences of living with step-parents, bonding us in ways I hadn't expected. Brittany was a whirlwind of chaos, often getting herself into trouble by talking to older boys and diving into situations that made me uneasy, a reflection of the turmoil in her home life. My new friend was pretty problematic. I guess you could say her behavior a cry for attention in a world that offered her little stability. Like me, she lived with her mom and stepdad, but her mother was fiercely protective, especially when it came to her biological father, a man she was rarely allowed to see without supervisions. Her mom was basically not too keen on her daughter chatting with her biological father, a rule that carried a weight I couldn't fully understand. The reasons shrouded in secrecy that Brittany never questioned aloud. One evening, Brittany invited me over for a sleepover, my first time at her house, a modest place that felt both familiar and foreign, the air thick with the unspoken tensions of her family. Brittany had invited me over to her house for a sleepover. On one occasion, a night that started with the innocent excitement of two young friends sharing secrets and laughter. Our sleeping bags spread out on her bedroom floor, but that innocence was shattered when her father arrived unexpectedly. His presence, a sudden storm that swept through the house, changing everything in an instant. Her dad dropped by unexpectedly, his arrival unannounced, his footsteps heavy as he entered the room. And I felt an immediate visceral fear that I couldn't explain, a primal instinct that told me to run. I kept my distance, my interactions with him brief, my words careful as I tried to shake the feeling that I was in the presence of something dangerous, something predatory. I kept my interactions with Mr. Creepy short and simple, a nickname I gave him in my mind, a way to cope with the unease that clung to me long after he left. That was the only time I ever met him, a fleeting encounter that left a lasting mark, a memory I buried as I moved on to high school, leaving that school and its dangers behind. I graduated from that middle school and started high school. My friendship with Brittany fading over time, our connection lost to the natural drift of growing up, though. I kept in touch with another friend, Rain, who became a constant in my life. One day, Rain and I met up at a local mall, the food court buzzing with the chatter of shoppers as we reminisced about our middle school days, laughter filling the air as we shared stories of simpler times. Rain and I had met up at a local mall, and were at the food court reminiscing the warmth of our friendship. A comfort until Rain's expression shifted her eyes, lighting up with the promise of gossip as she asked if I'd heard about Brittany. Rain perked up and asked me if I'd heard about what happened with Brittany, her tone a mix of excitement and gravity that made my stomach twist, expecting something trivial, but sensing something far darker. I obviously said no. That me and her sort of lost contact, my curiosity piqued as Rain leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper as she revealed a truth that turned my blood cold. Brittany's father was a predator, a man who had taken a life. His crime, a horrifying secret that had been uncovered through video surveillance and public tips. I hope that's wherever she is. She's doing okay. A wish for my old friend. A hope that she'd found peace amidst the storm her father had left in his wake. The unseen force on 6 Mile Road. On a lonely stretch of highway in the dead of night, I pulled off at a deserted exit to rest, only to find myself in the shadow of a mysterious warehouse, its presence a silent threat that turned my quiet journey into a nightmare. As my car began to shake violently, an unseen force rocking it back and forth. My dog whimpered in fear, and I felt the chilling certainty that I was not alone, that something or someone was watching from the darkness. I decided to pull off on a deserted exit with no services. I believe it was called 6 Mile Road, a decision that would haunt me a moment where the unknown reached out to claim me. I was on my first solo trip, a journey from Montana to Seattle, the open road stretching before me like a promise of freedom. My only companion, my loyal dog, curled up in the passenger seat. I went on my first trip alone to Seattle from Montana. I was alone with my dog. The thrill of independence, tempered by the solitude of the drive, the endless miles a canvas for my thoughts. The highway I-90 was a desolate ribbon cutting through the wilderness, its emptiness a stark contrast to the bustling cities I'd left behind, the signal fading as I drove deeper into the night. We were in the area of I-90 that doesn't have much signal and is pretty much just 100 empty. The silence broken only by the static of my radio, a BBC talk show, crackling with a spooky topic. I couldn't quite grasp the eerie atmosphere seeping into my bones. Exhaustion hit me hard, my eyes heavy as the radio failed the static, a grating reminder of how isolated I was. The road ahead shrouded in a swirling fog that danced just beyond my headlights. I suddenly got really tired, and my radio wasn't working, the weight of the drive pressing down on me, urging me to find a place to rest. Buzz. I spotted a sign for an exit, a lonely marker in the darkness, and decided to pull off, hoping for a quiet spot to sleep. There was fog on the road as well, swirling around just in front of my headlights. The mist a ghostly veil that obscured the world beyond, adding to the sense of unease that had begun to settle in my chest. The exit led to a narrow road, its name etched in my memory as 6 Mile Road. A desolate path that stretched into the void, devoid of any signs of life. No gas stations, no lights, just an endless expanse of nothing. There was absolutely nothing around me for like a mile. The isolation, a heavy weight, as I drove, the fog thickening around me, the darkness pressing in from all sides. After a short distance, the road ended at a massive structure, a white-gray warehouse, its windowless facade looming like a monolith, surrounded by a fleet of white vans and sleek black cars that seemed out of place in this remote wilderness. I pulled up to this huge sort of white-gray warehouse with no windows. There were several white vans and black cars parked around it, the vehicles' pristine condition. A stark contrast to the desolation, their presence hinting at something hidden. Something I wasn't meant to see. The warehouse was encircled by a towering barbed wire fence, its sharp edges glinting in the faint light of my headlights, a clear warning to keep out to turn back. The warehouse was locked by a huge barbed wire fence, its imposing barrier a silent threat that made my skin prickle with unease. The fog swirling around the concrete like a living thing carried by a slight breeze that whispered through the night. I backed my car away, the eerie silence of the place pressing down on me, and parked near a lone tree a short distance away, hoping for a moment of rest in this desolate place. I backed up my car a bit and I decided to park by the tree, the darkness enveloping me as I turned off the engine, the stillness broken only by the soft panting of my dog, his presence a small comfort in the face of the unknown. I wrapped myself in a blanket, locking all the doors. The fog outside my windows, a ghostly shroud that obscured the world beyond the silence, so profound it felt like a weight on my chest. Everything was still dark and silent. There was no wind except for a slight breeze carrying the fog, the atmosphere heavy with an unspoken tension that made my heart race, though I couldn't pinpoint why. I lay back trying to sleep, my dog nestled beside me, but rest wouldn't come. My mind was too alert, too aware of the strange facility nearby, its presence, a looming shadow that refused to fade. Then, without warning, my car began to shake, a violent, unnatural motion that rocked it back and forth, side to side, as if something massive had grabbed hold of it. My car started to physically shake. My dog started whining and hid behind the passenger chair, his distress mirroring my own. As I sat up, my heart pounding, peering out into the pitch-black night, my headlights off the darkness, swallowing everything beyond the glass. There was nothing. No animals, no people. Just the warehouse in the distance, its silhouette, a menacing outline against the fog. Yet the shaking continued, a force I couldn't see or understand. There was still nothing around me at all, except for the strange facility. The isolation, a terrifying reality as I turned the car, my hands trembling, and backed away. The shaking stopping as suddenly as it had begun. A wave of dread washed over me, a visceral feeling that I was being watched, that I'd stumbled into a place I wasn't meant to be, a place that held secrets I wasn't meant to uncover. I had this horrible feeling of dread, and that I was being watched, and that I wasn't supposed to be there, the instinct to flee, overwhelming as I drove back to the highway, my dog still trembling beside me. The fog following us like a specter in the night. Echoes from the grave. In the stillness of an ancient graveyard near my home, I stood over a crumbling gravestone, never imagining that the ground beneath me would give way, pulling me into a nightmare that bridged the living and the dead. That night, a Civil War soldier appeared in my dreams, his voice echoing with regret as he apologized for the terror I'd felt, a spectral encounter that left me questioning the boundaries of reality. I'm a member of a website that posts pictures of gravestones for people, a simple task that led me to a chilling experience I'd never forget. I've always been drawn to history, the stories etched in stone, a quiet reminder of lives long past, which is why I joined a website dedicated to photographing gravestones for those seeking to connect with their ancestors. A picture was requested of a very old gravestone in a graveyard walking distance from my house. The request, a small act of service that felt meaningful, a way to honor the forgotten. The graveyard was a familiar place, its weathered stones nestled in a quiet corner of my neighborhood, the air heavy with the scent of moss and earth, the silence broken only by the rustle of leaves in the wind. I walked there, my camera in hand, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the rows of graves, each one a silent sentinel of time. I found the grave I was looking for, its stone so eroded that the inscription was barely legible, the years having worn away the name and dates, leaving only whispers of the past. I stood over the almost 200-year-old grave to see if it was the grave that I was looking for, my eyes tracing the faded letters, my mind lost in the history beneath my feet. But as I stood there, the ground beneath me shifted, a sudden, terrifying sensation as my foot began to sink into the earth, the soil giving way like quicksand, pulling me down with a relentless grip. My foot suddenly began to sink into the grave, the cold earth swallowing me up to my hip, my heart pounding as I fought to free myself, panic rising like a tide as I imagined someone, reaching up to claim me. It felt like an eternity, my body trembling as I clawed at the ground, my shoe nearly slipping off in the struggle. The fear of being dragged into the grave overwhelming me. I nearly passed out. I was sure that something was going to grab my foot. Thought a primal terror that gripped me, my breaths shallow as I finally pulled free, collapsing onto the grass. Tears streaming down my face as I ran from the graveyard. The weight of the experience, a heavy burden on my soul. I was sobbing when I was done as I was running away. The memory of that moment, a haunting echo that followed me into the night, a nightmare that refused to let go. That night, as I lay in bed, the events at the graveyard replayed in my mind, the fear still fresh, a lingering dread that made sleep elusive. But when I finally drifted off, I found myself in a dream so vivid, it felt more real than the waking world. A vision that transported me to a battlefield, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and the cries of the wounded. I had an extremely vivid dream that I still remember, a dream where I stood amidst the chaos speaking to a soldier dressed in the tattered uniform of a bygone era, his eyes weary but kind as he shared his story. I was talking to what I thought was a Civil War soldier on a battlefield, his voice a soft drawl as he spoke of his life, his regrets, and the fear he'd caused me, apologizing with a sincerity that touched my heart, asking me to call him Charlie. The dream lingered long after I woke, the soldier's words echoing in my mind, a connection to the past that felt too real to dismiss as mere imagination. Determined to understand what had happened, I visited the local church, a quaint building that oversaw the graveyard, its stained glass windows casting colorful patterns on the wooden pews. I went to church to let them know about the collapsed grave, explaining the incident with a trembling voice, the memory of the sinking earth still vivid. A safety concern I couldn't ignore. The church staff listened, their faces a mix of concern and curiosity, and they pulled out an old map of the graveyard, tracing the plot to confirm the grave I'd described. What they found left me breathless, my jaw dropping as they revealed the truth. The grave belonged to a soldier who had died in the Civil War, a man whose first name was Charles, a name that matched the soldier from my dream with eerie precision. I was absolutely jaw-dropped to find out that the grave belonged to a soldier who was killed in the Civil War, and his first name was Charles. The coincidence, a chilling confirmation of the connection. I'd felt a bridge between the living and the dead that left me questioning the nature of the experience. The soldier's apology, a haunting echo that lingered in my heart. Whispers from the pink bathroom. From the moment I stepped into our new home across from the hospital, an unshakable feeling of being watched clung to me, a silent presence that turned every corner into a source of unease, especially in the eerie pink bathroom where the air felt too thick to breathe. The house whispered its secrets through its creaking halls and shadowy basement, where I sensed a tall man in a button-up shirt lurking his gaze, a constant weight that sent shivers down my spine. That place made me feel some type of way. It wasn't good or bad, just like I was always being watched, a sensation that would follow me long after we left, haunting my dreams with a truth I couldn't ignore. Our new home was a modest 2-story house. Its faded exterior, a stark contrast to the gleaming hospital across the street. The hospital's lot entrance aligning eerily with our driveway, a proximity that felt both comforting and ominous. This house was located directly across the street from a hospital. The constant hum of ambulances, a reminder of life's fragility, a backdrop to the unease that settled into my bones. From the moment we moved in, the house had a strange energy, not overtly malevolent, but unsettling. A feeling that eyes were always on me, tracking my every move through the narrow halls and cramped rooms. There were a handful of hot spots, too, throughout the house where I would feel this, places where the air seemed heavier, the shadows deeper, as if the house itself held memories. It refused to release. One of those spots was the pink bathroom, a relic of a bygone era, with its garish pink tiles, pink sink, and pink flooring. A small space that felt suffocating, despite its bright hues. One being what we called the pink bathroom, which was, as you can guess, all pink. The color overwhelming the room's tight confines, making it hard to breathe. A claustrophobic trap that left me uneasy every time I stepped inside. I always felt like it was a bit hard to breathe in there, the sensation more than just physical, a weight on my chest that made me hurry through my tasks, eager to escape the oppressive energy that lingered there. Another hotspot was the hallway connecting my bedroom to the living room. A T-shaped junction where I always felt a piercing gaze from the corner, a presence that watched me, whether I was in my room or the living room, its intensity unwavering. Another was this part of the hall that led directly into my bedroom and branched off directly into the living room as well. A space where the air seemed to hum with unseen eyes, a constant reminder that I was never truly alone. The basement was the third and most unsettling hotspot, a half-finished space that held both a furnished bar area and an unfinished section for laundry and storage, a place where the past seemed to linger in every shadowed corner. The final spot was, of course, the basement, its dual nature, a reflection of the house's split personality. The bar area with its stools, a remnant of forgotten gatherings. The unfinished, half-a-cluttered workshop, filled with echoes of the past. When we first moved in, my dad's sister and I explored the workshop, finding old yearbooks from my school and other memorabilia, a treasure trove of history that captivated us until we took a break for lunch. My dad and sister and I were looking through the workshop. There were a bunch of old yearbooks. Our curiosity cut short when we returned to find the door inexplicably jammed, the handle seemingly broken from the inside, a mystery that defied logic. The door would no longer open. It seemed like the door handle had fell off while we were away. The door locked from within, despite none of us touching it. A chilling reminder of the house's secrets. The basement became a place I dreaded, especially when my mom tasked my sister and me with washing our dog in the large tub sink down there, a chore that filled me with dread. My mom had my sister and I wash our dog down in the basement, the task a torment as I felt the constant gaze of an unseen figure, a tall man in a button-up shirt and slacks, standing by the bar area's entrance. His presence so vivid in my mind that I could almost see him. I imagined a very tall man in a button-up and slack standing in the corner, his image haunting me, my hair standing on end as I rushed through the chore, sprinting up the stairs the moment I was done, the oppressive energy of the basement chasing me like a shadow. I would sprint up those stairs whenever I was done down there, the relief of escaping its grip, a fleeting comfort in a house that never felt truly safe. Years after we moved out, the house continued to haunt me, its memory seeping into my dreams, turning them into night terrors that left me waking in a cold sweat. The echoes of that place refusing to fade here. I had had a handful of bad dreams about that house, the nightmares persisting long after we left, their frequency and intensity growing until they became a regular torment, a cycle that gripped me every few months. The live stream being my sister, telling me that someone had died in the pink bathroom, a recurring vision that felt too real, too specific to dismiss as mere imagination, prompting me to dig deeper into the house's history. Driven by the escalating night terrors, I began researching the house, determined to uncover the truth behind the haunting dreams that had plagued me for nearly a decade. I started researching the house after this, tracing its history back to the family who had built it, a journey that led me to a startling discovery. The first owner, a father, had suffered a massive heart attack in the house, a traumatic death that explained the heavy energy I'd felt. I quickly discovered that it was a family that lived there, and that the father had died in the house, his passing a violent echo that seemed to linger in the walls, especially given the house's location directly across from a hospital. A cruel irony for a man who couldn't be saved. I found his wife's obituary, learning she had remained in the house after his death, her life intertwined with its history, her children's details more accessible due to her more recent passing. I felt an inexplicable pull toward their daughter, a connection I couldn't ignore, and after some searching, I found her on Facebook, my heart racing as I crafted a careful message to reach out. I immediately felt drawn to one particular child, their one daughter. I actually ended up finding her on Facebook and reaching out too, mindful of the potential harm my inquiry might cause, but driven by a need to understand the truth. I mentioned the hot spots, the pink bathroom, the hallway, the basement, but withheld the sensations I'd felt, wanting her unfiltered response. Reese. My heart stopped when I read that he had died in that pink bathroom. Her words a chilling confirmation of my dream, the exact place where I'd envisioned her father's death. A coincidence, too precise to dismiss. I remembered where I dreamed my sister told me. Somebody had died in that pink bathroom. The revelation sending a shiver down my spine, a connection to the past that felt both haunting and profound. She shared more. Her father had cherished his workshop, a sacred space he kept private, and often lingered by the bar area's entrance where he stored his favorite drinks, the very spot where I'd sensed his presence. She continued to say that she loved his workshop and that he never let anyone in it, and on top of that, always spend time downstairs by that corner entrance in his bar. Her words aligning perfectly with my experiences. The tall man in my imagination, a mirror to her father, a 6'3" businessman, always dressed in a button-up and slacks. She sent me a photo and I was stunned by how closely he resembled the figure I'd envisioned, a ghostly echo of the past that left me breathless. I told the daughter, the man that I saw in my imagination, the very tall, well-dressed man. And she said that her dad was 6'3" and a businessman, always in a button-down and slacks. The image a haunting confirmation of the connection. I'd felt a bridge between the living and the dead that brought an unexpected peace. After that, the dreams stopped, as if the house had finally let me go. After this, I've never had another dream involved in that house, ever again. A quiet relief that left me wondering if I'd been a conduit for a father's message to his daughter. A whisper from beyond that had found its way through me. The elf in the shadows. On a crisp afternoon in the park with my dad, I peered into a steaming sewer hole, expecting nothing more than a playful trick, only to freeze at the sight of a strange man with a triangular hat, a figure that blurred the line between reality and magic. His image lingered in my mind for years, a haunting mystery that grew stranger as I realized how much he resembled me. His hair and posture, an eerie mirror to my own. All my life I've had weird paranormal, or I guess you could say borderline psychic occurrences. But this encounter at the park remains the most bewildering a moment that challenged everything I thought I knew. I was still in kindergarten, a time when the world felt full of wonder, especially during my after-school adventures with my dad, a man whose creativity turned ordinary days into magical quests. I was still in kindergarten when my dad picked me up, his warm smile, a constant as he drove us to the park, a sprawling green space filled with winding paths and hidden corners perfect for exploration. My dad was a master of imagination, often crafting treasure maps for me to follow, hiding small trinkets around the park for me to discover each, find a triumph that filled my young heart with joy. My dad was, and he's, a great man, and he used to make maps for treasures, for me to find a tradition that made every trip to the park a grand adventure, a shared secret between us that made me feel special, loved, and fearless. On this particular day, we were strolling through the park, as usual, the air cool and the grass soft beneath my sneakers, the familiar scent of pine and earth filling my lungs. We often used to stop by in the park on the way home, a ritual that brought us closer, a moment of connection amidst the chaos of daily life. As we walked, we noticed something unusual. A sewer hole in the path, its metal cover emitting waves of steam that rose like ghostly tendrils, the heat suggesting a hidden furnace below a mystery that piqued our curiosity. There was this sort of sewer hole from which were coming waves of steam, the sight both intriguing and strange, a puzzle in the middle of our familiar park, drawing us closer as we approached to investigate. My dad, ever the storyteller, crouched beside me with a playful grin, his eyes twinkling with mischief as he pointed to the hole. "Look," he said, his voice full of wonder. "Maybe this is where Santa prepares the gifts for the good children." My dad saying, "Look, maybe here is where Santa prepares the gifts for the good children." His words a whimsical suggestion that made me giggle, though I already knew Santa wasn't real. My young mind too practical to believe in such magic. But as I leaned over to peer through the holes in the cover, the steam swirling around me, I saw something that stopped me cold. A man sitting at a table below his head, adorned with a peculiar triangular hat, his hands busy as if writing or crafting something. A scene that felt both fantastical and impossible. As we passed by the hole, I looked through the holes of the covering, and what I saw was a man wearing a weird triangle. Shaped head, the image fleeting but vivid, a moment that etched itself into my memory. A mystery that would linger for years. The encounter happened so quickly, the steam obscuring my view, the holes in the cover offering only a fragmented glimpse of the man below. Yet the image was seared into my mind. His triangular hat, his seated figure, the strange sense that he was crafting something magical. The man was sitting on a table, and it looked as if he was writing something, a detail that confused my young mind. The scene surreal as I froze my thoughts. A whirlwind of wonder and doubt. Was this a real elf? A creature of Christmas magic brought to life? Or another of my dad's clever surprises, like the treasures he hid for me to find? I thought either that was a real elf, and my dad was telling the truth, or maybe it was a man hired by him for me to see. Just like he hid all the treasures, my mind torn between belief and skepticism. The moment a puzzle I couldn't solve. I didn't say anything to my dad, and he didn't ask, the silence between us heavy with unspoken questions. As we continued our walk, the park's familiar paths now tinged with a new layer of mystery. When we got home, I couldn't hold it in. I ran to my grandma, my words tumbling out as I shared what I'd seen. "I saw a Christmas elf in the park!" I exclaimed, my voice bright with excitement. I remember telling my grandma that I saw a Christmas elf in the park, her laughter a gentle dismissal as she patted my head. Her response a soft, "That's great," her tone making it clear she didn't believe me, my dad's chuckle echoing her disbelief. Truus, I knew she didn't believe me, obviously, and my dad was also laughing. Their reactions a quiet reminder of how fantastical my story sounded. A child's imagination run wild in their eyes. For days I couldn't stop thinking about the man in the sewer, the image replaying in my mind each detail as vivid as the moment I'd seen him, my young heart torn between wonder and doubt. I kept thinking about it, but with time I just went on with the idea that my dad told some man to dress up as an elf and jump in the sewer for me to see the explanation. A comforting one, a way to make sense of the impossible to believe my dad had orchestrated it, to keep the magic of childhood alive. But years later, I asked him about it. My curiosity reignited, needing to know the truth behind that strange encounter. I finally asked him about it, and he said that he never did this. His denial, a shock. His insistence that it was just my imagination, a challenge to the memory I held so dear, leaving me to question what I'd truly seen. I returned to the park as an adult, hoping to find answers. But the area had changed. The sewer hole was gone, replaced by a walking path and plain grass. The park's transformation erasing the physical evidence of that day. I even went to the exact same park since then to inspect that area. But a lot has changed since then, and that place looks totally different now. The absence of the hole, a final barrier to understanding a mystery that refused to be solved. Yet the strangest part came with time, as the man's image in my memory began to shift. His features becoming more familiar, his hair and build mirroring my own in ways that felt uncanny, a reflection that grew clearer with each passing year. Whenever I remember that man, I start comparing him more and more with myself. The resemblance, a haunting echo, that left me wondering if what I'd seen was more than a trick of the mind. A glimpse into something beyond the ordinary, a mystery that would forever linger in the shadows of my past. The red-eyed shadow on the roof. Under the starlit sky of a Mexican neighborhood, I played hide-and-seek on the rooftops with my friends. The thrill of the game heightened by the darkness, until a chilling encounter turned our laughter into screams. Hiding in a half-finished bathroom, I felt a hand grasp mine, a soft voice whispering comfort, only to discover the girl I thought I was with was far below, leaving me alone with a shadowy figure whose red eyes glowed in the night. We loved to play hide-and-seek with all the kids in the neighborhood at night, a childhood ritual that took a terrifying turn, revealing a presence that wasn't part of our game. Growing up in a tight-knit neighborhood in Mexico, our evenings were filled with the joyous chaos of childhood games, the narrow streets alive with the laughter of kids who knew every corner like the back of their hands. The houses were so close together, in fact, that you could jump from roof to roof, a labyrinth of rooftops that became our playground. The close proximity of the homes, allowing us to leap from one to another with ease. The adults in the neighborhood, familiar and friendly, never minded our rooftop escapades, their trust in us, a testament to the community's bond, with everybody sort of knowing each other and being friendly. They wouldn't mind if we did get on the roof. Their casual acceptance giving us the freedom to explore, to turn the rooftops into a stage for our adventures. One evening, my cousins came over for dinner, the adults gathering on the porch. Their voices a soft hum as they sipped drinks, the air warm with the scent of grilled food and the promise of a carefree night. We had my cousins come over for dinner, and their parents were just out in the porch, talking their presents. A comforting backdrop as a group of neighborhood kids approached, their eyes bright with excitement asking if we wanted to join a game of hide and seek. Some of the kids, they came over and asked if we wanted to play the invitation irresistible, as darkness settled over the neighborhood. The perfect time for our favorite game, the shadows adding a thrill to every hiding spot. Among the group was a girl I'd been smitten with for a while, her presence a flutter in my chest, a chance I couldn't pass up. There was this one girl, too, that I had a thing for. At the time, her smile a silent confirmation of the feelings we shared. A mutual spark that made me determined to steal a moment alone with her during the game. We gathered in the middle of the street, the group buzzing with anticipation as we chose a seeker. The rest of us scattering to find hiding spots as the countdown began. All gathered in the middle of the street, and we randomly chose who would count the familiar ritual. Kicking off with shouts and laughter, the kids darting in every direction to hide. I caught the girl's eye, waving her over with a grin. My heart racing as I took her hand and led her toward my aunt's house, a vacant property perfect for our escape. Threes. I looked at the girl, waving at her to come follow me. Holding my hand, I led her to my aunt's house, which was vacant. At the time, the house empty, while my aunt was away, a quiet sanctuary. I knew no other kids had chosen its solitude, a chance for us to be alone. The front door of my aunt's house was locked, a minor setback that didn't deter us as we raced to the back, hoping for an open entry, but the back door was secured as well. The front door was locked, so we ran to the back and checked if it was locked too. And it was the house sealed tight. Its silence, a stark contrast to the lively chaos of the game unfolding around us. But I knew a way in. At the back, an old washing machine stood against the wall, its rusted surface a makeshift ladder to the roof, a path I'd taken before during our rooftop games. At the back of the house, my aunt had an old washing machine that I knew that we could get on the roof from there. The machine a sturdy foothold as I helped the girl climb up. First, her laughter soft as she reached the roof, her silhouette a shadow against the starlit sky. I followed close behind my hands, gripping the edge as I pulled myself up the rooftop. Stretching out before us, a maze of tiles and chimneys, perfect for hiding. I helped her up first, and when we got up, we could hear someone coming. The sound of footsteps echoing from below. A seeker approaching the house next door. Its second story under construction, a half-finished structure that offered plenty of hiding spots. I whispered to the girl to hide watching as she darted across the roof, her figure disappearing into the shadows as I found my own spot in a partially built bathroom. Its walls incomplete, the darkness within a perfect cloak. I hid in a sort of half-completed bathroom. The space pitch black, the air cool against my skin as I crouched low, my heart pounding with the thrill of the game and the hope of a stolen moment with her. I thought I was alone, the silence of the bathroom wrapping around me like a shroud, until I felt a hand grasp mine. The touch unexpected, sending a jolt through me as a soft voice whispered, "It's just me, don't worry." I felt someone grabbed my hand. It was pitch black in there. I couldn't see who it was, but I heard a soft voice whisper, "It's just me, don't worry." The voice unmistakably hers. Her gentle squeeze, a reassurance that warmed me the moment a quiet victory as we hid together. Her presence, a comfort in the dark. We stayed there hand in hand, the game unfolding around us, the distant shouts of the other kids, a faint echo, until they called out, "We give up!" signaling the end of the round. We could all hear the kids saying we'd give up, their voices pulling me from our hiding spot as I stepped out, looking down at the street where the group had gathered. Eyes locking onto the girl, standing below. Looking up at me with a smile, my blood ran cold. A wave of panic washing over me as I realized she was down there, far from the rooftop. her presence on the street. A chilling contradiction to the hand I still felt in mine. I came out of the bathroom and looked down at the street where all the other kids were. That was when I saw her clear as day, looking at me, the realization hitting me like a blow. If she was there, then who was holding my hand? I turned slowly, the grip still tight, the darkness revealing only the faint outline of a figure, its eyes glowing a soft, eerie red, staring directly into mine. All I could manage to see was the faint outline of someone with glowing sort of red eyes, looking right in my face, the sight sending me into a frenzy of fear as I yanked my hand free, scrambling down from the roof. The kids below pointing up in horror, their voices a chorus of, "Who was that?" as they too saw the shadowy figure with those haunting red eyes, a presence that vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving us shaken and fleeing into the night. Thank you for listening till the end. Tomas, if you hear a knock at 3 a.m. tonight, don't answer it. Maybe the next story is coming. Symbiotes for you. See you the same in your next nightmare.